When the billionaire with trembling hands offered her $2 million to pretend to be his wife for 6 weeks, Deborah Smith thought she understood desperation, until she discovered the truth. Everything exploded. What was he hiding? The rain had started as a whisper against the tall windows of the Sterling Club, but by the time Deborah Smith finished her shift, it had become a roar. She stood in the staff locker room, counting her tips with practiced efficiency. $243. Not bad for a Tuesday night. She folded the bills carefully and tucked them into the worn leather wallet she'd carried since college, the one with the small tear on the corner that she'd never bothered to fix because it reminded her that nothing lasted forever, including bad times. 7 years. 7 years of perfecting the smile that never reached her eyes, of memorizing drink orders and dietary restrictions, of laughing at jokes that weren't funny, and pretending not to notice when married men slipped their wedding rings into their pockets. 7 years of being invisible while standing in plain sight, of serving people who spent more on a single bottle of wine than she made in a month. But it was almost over. 3 more months, and she'd have enough saved to open her cafe in Brooklyn. Nothing fancy, just a small place with good coffee, better pastries, and windows that let in the light. Deborah pulled her coat on and checked her reflection in the narrow mirror mounted on the inside of her locker door. Her dark brown skin glowed despite the fluorescent lighting, her natural hair pulled back into a neat bun that had started to frizz slightly in the humidity. She looked tired, she thought, but tired was better than defeated. At 29, she'd learned the difference. The Sterling Club occupied the top 3 floors of a building in Midtown Manhattan, and its membership list read like a who's who of American wealth. Deborah had served tech moguls and hedge fund managers, actors and politicians, old money and new. She'd learned their patterns, their preferences, their tells. She knew who was about to file for divorce before their spouses did, which startups were about to fold, and which senators were about to be indicted. The wealthy talked freely around service staff, as if being paid to bring them things made you deaf and dumb. But Deborah was neither. She was observant and patient, and she'd saved nearly every dollar she'd earned beyond rent and basic expenses. Her studio apartment in Washington Heights was small enough that she could touch both walls if she stood in the center and stretched her arms out, but it was hers, and it was temporary. Everything in her life right now was temporary, a bridge between who she'd been and who she was becoming. She pushed through the staff exit into the October night, pulling her coat tighter against the rain. The subway station was 2 blocks away, and she'd learned to time her exit to avoid the late-night crowd that spilled out of the bars on 3rd Avenue. But tonight, someone was waiting by the door. David Ashford stood under the small awning, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of an overcoat that probably cost more than her yearly rent. He wasn't holding an umbrella despite the rain, and water dripped from his dark hair onto his shoulders. For a moment, Deborah thought she'd imagined him, the David Ashford, the tech billionaire whose face appeared on magazine covers with the regularity of clockwork, standing outside the staff entrance of the Sterling Club like he was waiting for a bus. "Miss Smith," he said, his voice cutting through the sound of rain on pavement. "I was hoping to catch you." Deborah's first instinct was to keep walking. She dealt with enough entitled men to know that nothing good came from conversations that started with them waiting for you in the dark. But something in his posture stopped her, the way he held himself, tense and uncertain, like a man about to jump off a cliff and unsure if he'd packed a parachute. "Mr. Ashford," she said carefully, maintaining the professional distance she'd perfected over 7 years. "Is there something I can help you with? If you have a complaint about the service this evening, you should speak with the manager." "No complaint," he said quickly. "The service was perfect. It's always perfect when you're working." He paused, and Deborah saw his jaw tighten in that way she'd noticed earlier, when he thought no one was watching. "I need to talk to you about something. Somewhere private. There's a coffee shop around the corner that stays open late." Every alarm bell in Deborah's head started ringing. "Mr. Ashford, I don't think that's appropriate. If you need to discuss club business, you should speak with management during regular hours. It's not club business." He stepped forward, and the light from the street lamp caught his face. He looked exhausted, she realized, and something else, desperate. "Please. Just give me 15 minutes. If you want to leave after that, I'll call you a car service, pay you for your time, and never bother you again." Deborah should have said no. Every instinct she'd honed over years of navigating the uncomfortable advances of wealthy men told her to walk away, get on the subway, and forget this conversation had ever happened. But there was something in his eyes that didn't match the usual predatory gleam she'd learned to recognize. This was different. This was fear. 15 minutes, she said finally. And I'm timing it. The coffee shop was one of those anonymous 24-hour places that catered to insomniacs and night shift workers, all fluorescent lights and cracked vinyl booths. David chose a table in the back corner, as far from the windows as possible, and ordered 2 coffees without asking what she wanted. When the server left, he sat forward with his hands clasped on the table, and Deborah noticed they were trembling slightly. "I'm going to say something that's going to sound insane," he began, "and I need you to hear me out completely before you respond. Can you do that?" Deborah wrapped her hands around the coffee cup that had just arrived, using the warmth to ground herself. "I'm listening." "I need you to pretend to be my wife," David said flatly, as if he were ordering lunch instead of proposing the most absurd arrangement Deborah had ever heard. "For 6 weeks. I'll pay you $2 million. The number hung in the air between them, so large it seemed to distort reality around it. $2 million. Deborah's cafe fund contained $42,000, saved penny by penny over 7 years. $2 million was more money than she'd earn in a lifetime of serving drinks to people who'd never bothered to learn her name. $2 million was freedom. But freedom always had a price, and Deborah had learned not to trust anything that seemed too good to be true. "Why?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended, but she didn't soften it. If he wanted something from her, he could at least have the decency to explain what and why. David's laugh was bitter, a sound that seemed to scrape its way out of his throat. "Because I'm dying, Miss Smith. Brain tumor. Inoperable. 6 months, maybe 8 if I'm unlucky. And my grandfather's will stipulates that I must be married to inherit a controlling interest in Ashford Industries. Without it, the board will tear apart everything I've built, sell it for parts, and destroy the livelihoods of 40,000 employees." Deborah studied his face, looking for the lie. She'd learned to read people in this job, to spot the tells that gave away deception. But David Ashford sat across from her with the stillness of someone who'd already accepted their death sentence, and his eyes held nothing but exhausted honesty. "Why not marry someone real?" she asked. "Someone from your world? Surely there's no shortage of women who'd be willing to marry a billionaire, even a dying one." "Because everyone in my world wants something," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Power, connections, association with the Ashford name. They see the money and the influence, and they'll smile and play whatever role they think I want them to play. But you..." He paused, and something like vulnerability crossed his face. "You're the first person in 5 years who served me without trying to network, flirt, or pitch me an app idea. You see me, but you don't want me. That's rare. That's valuable." Deborah felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You've been watching me." "I've been a member of the Sterling Club for 3 years, David said. "You've served me dozens of times. You know my drink order, you know I prefer the corner table by the window, and you've never once asked me for anything beyond what I'd like for dinner. Do you know how unusual that is?" "I'm doing my job," Deborah said flatly. "Exactly." David leaned back, and for the first time since they'd sat down, his hands stopped trembling. "You're professional, discreet, and you keep clear boundaries. Those are exactly the qualities I need for this arrangement. 6 weeks, Miss Smith. We get married in a quiet ceremony, you attend a few family events with me, we present a convincing picture to my grandfather before he validates his will, and then when I'm gone, you file for a quiet divorce and walk away $2 million richer. No one gets hurt, 40,000 people keep their jobs, and you get to open that cafe you've been saving for." Deborah's head snapped up. "How do you know about the cafe?" David had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "You keep a notebook in your apron pocket. Sometimes when you think no one's watching, you sketch designs and write notes. I'm observant too, Miss Smith. It's how I built a $50 billion company." The coffee had gone cold in Deborah's hands, but she couldn't seem to put it down. Her mind raced through the implications of what he was proposing. 6 weeks of her life in exchange for financial freedom. 6 weeks of pretending to be married to a dying man, of playing a role in a world she'd only ever observed from the margins. 6 weeks, and then she'd be free. But something didn't add up. Deborah had served enough wealthy people to know they didn't give away $2 million for 6 weeks of acting, no matter how desperate they were. There had to be more to this, some angle she wasn't seeing. "What's the catch?" she asked. "No catch," David said. "You'll need to sign a non-disclosure agreement, of course. And you'll need to be convincing. My grandfather is old-fashioned, but is not stupid. He'll expect us to know each other, to be comfortable together. We'll need to spend time getting to know each other before we make the announcement. And after you die? Deborah heard herself ask, hating how clinical it sounded. What happens to me then? You file for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences or whatever your lawyer suggests. The prenup will give you the $2 million regardless of how long the marriage lasted. You walk away clean. Deborah set the coffee cup down carefully, buying herself time to think. $2 million. Her cafe. Freedom from the Sterling Club and the endless parade of wealthy people who looked through her instead of at her. But 6 weeks pretending to be married to a dying man, stepping into a world where she'd always been invisible, making herself visible in a way that felt dangerous. I need time to think about it, she said finally. You have 24 hours, David replied, pulling a business card from his pocket and sliding it across the table. My private number is on the back. Call me tomorrow by 8 p.m. with your answer. If I don't hear from you, I'll assume it's no, and you'll never see me again. He stood up, pulling out his wallet and dropping a $100 bill on the table for 2 cups of coffee that cost $5 total. Then he looked at her with those exhausted, desperate eyes one more time. For what it's worth, Miss Smith, I hope you say yes. Not because I need you to, I can find someone else if necessary. But because you deserve to stop serving people like me and start building something that's entirely yours. Then he was gone, disappearing into the rainy Manhattan night like a ghost, leaving Deborah alone with a cold cup of coffee and a business card that felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket. She sat there for a long time after he left, staring at the rain streaking down the windows, thinking about 7 years of being invisible and how tempting it was to step into the light, even if that light was borrowed from someone else's life. $2 million. Freedom. But at what cost? The server came by to refill her coffee, and Deborah noticed the woman's tired eyes, the way her uniform was slightly worn at the collar, the heaviness in her movements that spoke of too many hours on her feet. 7 years ago, that had been Deborah. In 3 months, if everything went according to plan, she'd finally escape it. Or she could say yes to David Ashford's insane proposal and escape it tomorrow. Deborah pulled out her phone and Googled David Ashford, something she'd never bothered to do before. The search results were overwhelming. Articles about his company, his philanthropy, his net worth, his rumored relationship with a supermodel that had ended 2 years ago. But it was an article from 6 months ago that made her stop scrolling. Tech mogul David Ashford quietly donates $500 million to cancer research. She clicked the link and read about how Ashford Industries had donated anonymously, only revealed when a financial journalist had traced the funding. The article speculated about why someone so young would make such a massive donation to cancer research, whether he had a personal connection to the disease. Now she knew. He did have a personal connection. He was dying. Deborah closed her phone and tucked it back into her pocket, her decision made without her quite realizing when she'd made it. She'd call him tomorrow, but she already knew what her answer would be. 7 years of being invisible, of watching other people live their lives while she served them drinks and smiled and faded into the background. Maybe it was time to step into the light, even if it was terrifying. Maybe it was time to take the risk. $2 million. 6 weeks. And then freedom. What could go wrong? Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. Deborah didn't sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed in her studio apartment, listening to the radiator clank and hiss while rain drummed against the single window, and tried to convince herself that what David Ashford had proposed was insane. But insanity, she was discovering, looked a lot like opportunity when you tilted your head and squinted at it from the right angle. At 3 in the morning, she got up and made tea, sitting cross-legged on her bed with her laptop balanced on her knees. She pulled up spreadsheets she'd maintained religiously for 7 years: income, expenses, savings projections. With her current trajectory, she'd have enough to open the cafe in 3 months, assuming nothing went wrong. But her budget was tight, razor-thin, with no margin for error. One emergency, one unexpected expense, and everything would fall apart. $2 million eliminated that fear entirely. $2 million meant she could open the cafe, hire staff, market properly, and still have enough left over to weather the inevitable rocky first year when most small businesses failed. $2 million was security, something she'd never had in her entire life. But it also meant lying. It meant stepping into David Ashford's world of wealth and privilege and pretending to be someone she wasn't. It meant being visible in a way that made her skin crawl, being photographed and discussed and scrutinized by people who'd never bothered to learn her name when she was serving them drinks. By the time dawn broke over Manhattan, painting her apartment in shades of gray and gold, Deborah had made her decision. She'd made it somewhere between her third and fourth cup of tea, when she'd realized that fear of visibility had kept her invisible for 29 years, and maybe it was time to be seen, even if it was terrifying. She went to work that day in a daze, moving through her shift on autopilot while her mind spun scenarios and contingencies. She served lunch to a table of investment bankers who argued loudly about market trends, poured wine for a Silicon Valley entrepreneur who spent the entire meal on his phone, and refilled water glasses for an elderly couple who barely spoke to each other. Her world, the one she was about to leave behind. At 7:30 that evening, after her shift ended, Deborah pulled out the business card David had given her. His private number was written on the back in neat, precise handwriting. She stared at it for a full minute before pulling out her phone and dialing. He answered on the first ring. "Miss Smith." "How did you know it was me?" she asked, thrown off balance by his certainty. "I've been staring at my phone for the last 3 hours," he admitted. "Yours was the only call I was expecting. What's your answer?" Deborah took a deep breath. "I have conditions." There was a pause, and then she heard something that might have been relief in his voice. "I'm listening. I want everything in writing. The $2 million, the timeline, what exactly you expect from me, and an ironclad NDA that protects me as much as it protects you. I want my own lawyer to review every document before I sign anything." "Agreed," David said immediately. "What else?" "I want to keep working at the Sterling Club until we make this public. I'm not giving up my income until I know this is real." "That's reasonable. Though I'd prefer you didn't. It will be easier to build our cover story if you're available during the day." "Then you'll need to compensate me for lost wages," Deborah countered. $200 a day for every day you need me to be available." Another pause. "You're negotiating with me. You came to me with a business proposition, Mr. Ashford. I'm treating it like business." This time, his laugh sounded genuine, lacking the bitter edge it had carried the night before. "Fair enough. 200 a day, plus the 2 million at the end. Anything else?" Deborah's hand tightened on the phone. "I want to know the real reason you're doing this. And don't tell me it's about your employees or your grandfather's will. Nobody gives away $2 million out of pure altruism, no matter how wealthy they are." The silence stretched so long that Deborah thought he might have hung up. Then David spoke, his voice quieter than before, almost vulnerable. "You're right. It's not just about the inheritance or the employees, though those things are true. It's about my grandfather refusing to see me as anything more than a disappointment. It's about proving to him that I'm capable of choosing something real over the parade of socialites and influencers he thinks represent my taste in women. It's about wanting, just once before I die, to be seen as more than my bank account." He paused. "You asked for honesty, Miss Smith. That's as honest as I can be." Something in Deborah's chest tightened. She recognized the need to be seen, to be acknowledged as fully human rather than a function or a stereotype. She'd felt it every day at the Sterling Club, watching wealthy patrons look through her as if she were furniture. "My name is Deborah," she said softly. "If we're going to do this, you should use it." "Deborah," he repeated, testing the name like he was tasting something new. "Then you should call me David. No more Mr. Ashford." "When do we start?" "Tomorrow," David said. "I'll send a car for you at 10 a.m. We'll meet with lawyers, sign the preliminary agreements, and then we'll start building our story. The wedding is in 2 weeks, just enough time to make it look spontaneous but not suspicious." 2 weeks. Deborah's voice cracked slightly. "That's not enough time to." "It has to be," David interrupted gently. "My grandfather's health is deteriorating faster than expected. His doctors give him a month, maybe less. We need to be married and convincingly settled before he finalizes his will." Deborah closed her eyes, wondering what she was getting herself into. "Okay. 2 weeks. Send me the address where I should meet you. I'll text you the details within the hour. Deborah." He paused. "Thank you. I know this is asking a lot." "You're paying me $2 million, she reminded him. "That's enough, thanks." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. Some part of her, the part that had spent 7 years being invisible, was curious about what it would feel like to step into the light, even if that light was borrowed and temporary. The car that arrived for her the next morning was sleek and black, the kind of vehicle Deborah had only ever seen dropping off Sterling Club members. The driver, an older man with kind eyes and a professional demeanor, held the door open for her without a hint of judgment about her worn jeans and sensible jacket. Deborah slid into the leather interior, feeling like an imposter, and tried to ignore the nervous flutter in her stomach. They drove to a building in the financial district, all glass and steel reaching toward the sky. David met her in the lobby, looking more put together than he had at their late-night coffee shop meeting. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, his hair styled, his expression neutral. But Deborah noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw still tightened when he thought she wasn't looking. "Ready?" he asked. "No," she admitted. "But let's do this anyway." The lawyer's office occupied the entire 40th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying view of Manhattan spread out below. David introduced her to 3 different lawyers, his personal attorney, a contract specialist, and someone whose title Deborah didn't quite catch but who seemed to exist solely to make sure every possible contingency was covered. They sat at a massive conference table, and for the next 4 hours, Deborah read through contracts and agreements that made her head spin. But she forced herself to focus, to read every line, to ask questions when something didn't make sense. David had been true to his word, everything was there, spelled out in excruciating legal detail. $2 million upon completion of a 6-week marriage. Compensation for lost wages. An NDA that protected both parties. A prenuptial agreement that was surprisingly generous, giving her the $2 million regardless of what happened. "I want my own lawyer to review these," Deborah said when she'd finished reading. "Before I sign anything." One of David's lawyers, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Chen, nodded approvingly. "Smart. We'd be suspicious if you didn't. I can recommend someone, if you'd like, someone who's not connected to the Ashford family and will represent your interests exclusively." "I'd appreciate that," Deborah said, surprised by the woman's helpfulness. Patricia slid a business card across the table. "Reginald Morrison. Tell him I sent you. He's expensive, but Mr. Ashford will cover his fees as part of the arrangement." After the lawyers, David took her to lunch at a restaurant so expensive it didn't have prices on the menu. They sat by a window overlooking Central Park, and David ordered for both of them without asking what she wanted, something that would have annoyed her if the food hadn't been extraordinary. "So," David said, once the server had left them alone, "we need to build our story. How did we meet? How long have we been dating? What made me fall in love with you?" Deborah set down her fork, the food suddenly tasting like ash. "You want me to create a fictional love story." "I want us to create a believable narrative," David corrected. "My grandfather is old-fashioned, but is not stupid. He'll ask questions. Our friends will ask questions. The media will definitely ask questions once we announce the engagement. We need to have consistent answers." "The truth is easier to remember than a lie," Deborah pointed out. "Then let's stick as close to the truth as possible," David said. "We met at the Sterling Club." "That's true. You've been serving me for years." "Also, true. What if we say that I finally worked up the courage to ask you out 3 months ago? We've been dating quietly, keeping it private because of the attention my name attracts. We fell in love, and when I found out about my diagnosis, I realized I didn't want to waste any more time. So, I proposed." Deborah turned the story over in her mind, looking for holes. 3 months is fast for an engagement. "I'm dying," David said bluntly. "That makes people accept accelerated timelines. Love in the face of mortality, it's romantic, tragic, the kind of story people want to believe." "It's manipulative," Deborah said, but without real heat. She was starting to understand how David had built a $50 billion company. He understood people, understood how to shape narratives, how to give people the story they wanted to hear. "It's a strategy," David replied. "There's a difference. Are you uncomfortable with the story?" Deborah considered the question seriously. "I'm uncomfortable with all of this," she admitted. "But I agreed to do it, so I might as well do it right. 3 months of secret dating, proposal after diagnosis, quick wedding because time is precious. I can work with that." "Good." David pulled out his phone and opened a note-taking app. "Now we need details. What's my favorite thing about you? What's yours about me? What do we argue about? What makes us laugh together? What's your coffee order? And do I remember to bring it to you without asking? For the next 2 hours, they built a relationship out of words and imagination, creating shared memories that had never happened and inside jokes that had never been funny in the moment. It felt surreal and slightly nauseating, like building a house of cards in a windstorm. But Deborah found herself getting caught up in it despite her reservations, adding details and quirks that made their fictional relationship feel more real. "You're good at this," David observed, watching her sketch out a timeline of their supposed relationship on a napkin. "I've spent 7 years watching relationships unfold at the Sterling Club," Deborah said. "You learn what works and what doesn't. You learn how couples who actually like each other behave versus couples who are just going through the motions." She paused, meeting his eyes. "We need to look like we actually like each other, not just like we're performing for an audience." "Do you like me?" David asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. "I don't know you well enough to answer that." "Then we should fix that," he said. "Because if we can't convince my grandfather that this is real, none of the rest matters. He'll see through us in 30 seconds, and everything falls apart." David paid the check. Deborah didn't want to think about how much the meal had cost, and they walked out into the afternoon sunlight. The park stretched before them, full of people living their normal lives, oblivious to the strange arrangement being negotiated in their midst. "Tell me something real about yourself," David said as they walked. "Something that's not in your employee file or on social media. Something true." Deborah thought about deflecting, about maintaining the professional distance she perfected over 7 years. But if they were going to pull this off, they needed to actually know each other, at least a little bit. "I wanted to be a chef," she said finally. "When I was young, I thought I'd go to culinary school, work in fancy restaurants, maybe open my own place someday. But culinary school costs money I didn't have, and I needed to work, so I became a waitress instead. The cafe is the compromise. I can bake, make good coffee, and create a menu that's mine. It's not what I dreamed of, but it's close enough." David was quiet for a moment. "What would you have done if you'd had the money? Where would you have gone?" "Le Cordon Bleu in Paris," Deborah said without hesitation. "I had the brochures, had the application half filled out. But then my mom got sick, and I needed to work to help with medical bills, and by the time she died, I was 23, and it felt too late to start over." "I'm sorry about your mother," David said quietly. Deborah shrugged, uncomfortable with his sympathy. "It was 6 years ago. I've had time to accept it." "Accepting something and being okay with it are different things," David observed. "Grief doesn't follow a timeline." They walked in silence for a while, and Deborah found herself studying David when she thought he wasn't looking. He moved through the world with the unconscious confidence of someone who'd never had to question whether he belonged somewhere, but there was a heaviness to him too, a weight he carried that had nothing to do with wealth or power. "Your turn," she said. "Tell me something real about yourself." David's smile was sardonic. "You want to know the truth about David Ashford, billionaire tech mogul? I'm terrified all the time. Terrified that I'm one bad decision away from losing everything. Terrified that I've built an empire on nothing but timing and luck. Terrified that my grandfather is right when he says I'm not capable of understanding what really matters in life." "And what does he think really matters?" Deborah asked. "Family. Legacy. Building something that outlasts you." David's jaw tightened in that familiar way. "He thinks I've wasted my life building a company instead of building relationships. He thinks I'm shallow and selfish, chasing money and status instead of substance. And maybe he's right." "Are you?" Deborah asked bluntly. "Shallow and selfish?" David looked at her, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw him without any masks or pretense. "I don't know. I've spent so much time building Ashford Industries that I'm not sure who I am without it. Maybe that's why I lied about dying, because part of me wishes it were true. At least then I'd have an excuse for why I've never figured out how to actually live." The admission hung between them, raw and uncomfortable. Deborah didn't know what to say to that level of honesty, didn't know how to respond to a man who had everything but wished for nothing. "You're not dying," she said finally. "So maybe you should figure out how to live while you still have time." David's laugh was bitter. "That's what the therapist says. Though she charges $300 an hour to tell me that." "I'll tell you for free," Deborah said. "Consider it part of the arrangement." They walked back to where the car was waiting, and David helped her into the back seat with a courtesy that felt genuine rather than performative. Before he closed the door, he leaned down, his expression serious. "Meet me tomorrow at my house," he said. "We need to practice being comfortable with each other before we make any public appearances. My grandfather will expect us to act like a couple who are actually in love, not like business associates who just met." "What does that entail?" Deborah asked warily. "I don't know," David admitted. "But we should probably figure it out before we're in front of an audience." 10 a.m. Deborah nodded, and he closed the door, stepping back as the car pulled away from the curb. She watched him through the window, standing alone on the sidewalk in his expensive suit, looking like the loneliest person in Manhattan. That night, Deborah met with Reginald Morrison, the lawyer Patricia had recommended. He was older, with gray hair and shrewd eyes that missed nothing. They sat in his office while he reviewed the contracts David's team had prepared, and Deborah waited nervously for him to find the catch, the hidden clause that would reveal this whole arrangement as too good to be true. "This is remarkably fair," Reginald said finally, looking up from the documents with surprise. "Almost suspiciously fair. You're sure Mr. Ashford isn't expecting anything beyond what's outlined here?" "He says he isn't," Deborah replied. "But I don't know him well enough to be sure." Reginald tapped his pen against the desk thoughtfully. "My job is to protect your interests, Ms. Smith, so I'm going to be blunt. This contract gives you $2 million for 6 weeks of pretending to be married to one of the wealthiest men in America. There's no clause requiring physical intimacy, no expectation that you'll continue the relationship beyond the agreed-upon timeline, and the NDA protects you as much as it protects him. If I were David Ashford's lawyer, I'd be advising him not to sign this." "What are you saying?" Deborah asked. "I'm saying that either David Ashford is a fool, which I doubt given his business record, or he's being sincere about his motivations. This contract is designed to protect you, Ms. Smith. It gives you power in this arrangement, not just money." He paused. "The question you need to ask yourself is why. Why would a man like David Ashford structure a deal that puts him at a disadvantage?" Deborah thought about their conversation in the park, about the loneliness she'd seen in David's eyes, about his admission that he didn't know who he was outside of his company. Maybe the answer was simpler than she'd thought. Maybe David Ashford was tired of being treated like a bank account with a pulse, and he was willing to pay for the novelty of being seen as human. "What do you recommend?" she asked. "I recommend you sign," Reginald said. "But I also recommend you be careful. Money changes people, Ms. Smith. $2 million is enough to make someone forget who they were before they had it. Make sure you know who you are and what you want before you step into this arrangement, because once you do, there's no going back to invisible." Deborah left his office with the signed contracts in her bag and a knot of anxiety in her stomach. In 2 weeks, she'd be married to David Ashford. In 6 weeks, she'd be free and wealthy enough to never worry about money again. But Reginald's warning echoed in her mind as she rode the subway back to her tiny apartment. Once you do, there's no going back to invisible. Deborah had spent 7 years being invisible. She'd perfected it, gotten comfortable with it, built a life around it. But maybe comfort was just another word for fear, and maybe it was time to be afraid of something new. David Ashford's house wasn't a house. It was an estate that sprawled across 3 acres in the Hamptons, all modernist architecture and floor-to-ceiling windows that seemed designed to erase the boundary between inside and outside. The car that picked Deborah up at 7 a.m. had driven for nearly 2 hours, leaving behind the cramped chaos of Manhattan for manicured lawns and ocean views that probably cost more per square foot than most people earned in a year. Deborah stood in the circular driveway, feeling absurdly out of place in her jeans and simple blouse, watching the morning sun glint off windows that were probably worth more than her entire apartment building. A woman in her 50s, elegant in a way that spoke of old money and good breeding, appeared at the front door before Deborah could decide whether to knock or wait. "You must be Deborah," the woman said, her smile warm but assessing. "I'm Catherine, David's executive assistant. He's finishing a call in his office, but he asked me to make you comfortable. Please, come in." The interior was all clean lines and expensive minimalism. White walls, dark hardwood floors, furniture that looked sculptural rather than functional. But there were small details that humanized the space. A stack of books on the coffee table, worn and obviously read rather than decorative, a pair of running shoes kicked off by the door, a coffee mug with a ring stain on the granite countertop. Evidence that someone actually lived here, not just staged it for a magazine spread. Catherine led her through the house to a sunroom that overlooked the ocean, where breakfast had been laid out on a table set for 2. "David will be with you shortly. Can I get you anything while you wait? Coffee, tea?" Coffee would be great, Deborah said, then hesitated. Actually, I can get it myself. You don't need to wait on me. Catherine's smile widened slightly. David mentioned you worked in service. That must make this all rather strange for you. You have no idea, Deborah admitted. For what it's worth, Catherine said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, I've worked for David for 12 years. He's a good man, even if he's terrible at remembering to eat lunch or sleep like a normal human. Whatever arrangement you two have made, I hope it works out well for both of you. She left before Deborah could respond, and Deborah found herself alone with the ocean view and a breakfast spread that could have fed 10 people. She was pouring coffee when David appeared in the doorway, dressed more casually than she'd seen him, dark jeans, a grey Henley, bare feet. It made him look younger, more approachable, and Deborah felt something uncomfortable shift in her chest. Sorry about the wait, he said, dropping into the chair across from her. Crisis in Tokyo that couldn't wait, apparently. Did Catherine take care of you? She's efficient, Deborah said. And perceptive. She knows about our arrangement, David admitted. I needed someone I trust to help coordinate everything. The wedding, the media strategy, managing my grandfather's expectations. Catherine has been with me since I started the company. She's family, in the ways that matter. Deborah filed that information away, adding Catherine to the mental list of people who would be watching her performance, judging whether she was convincing enough. So what's the plan for today? You said we needed to practice being comfortable with each other. David reached for a croissant, tearing it apart with his fingers rather than using a knife. I thought we'd spend the day together. Just existing in the same space. Getting used to each other. My grandfather will expect us to have the kind of ease that comes from actually spending time together, not from reading each other's Wikipedia pages. I don't have a Wikipedia page, Deborah pointed out. You will after we announce the engagement, David said. Someone will create one within hours. They'll dig up your high school yearbook photos, interview your former roommates, find out where you went to college and what you studied. Your life will become public domain. The croissant Deborah had been reaching for suddenly seemed less appealing. I'm not sure I thought that part through. It's not too late to back out, David said, his voice careful. The contracts aren't final until the wedding. If you've changed your mind. I haven't, Deborah interrupted. I'm just adjusting my expectations. I've spent 7 years being invisible. Being visible is going to take some getting used to. David studied her across the table, his dark eyes thoughtful. Tell me about invisible. What does that mean to you? Deborah wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, using the warmth to ground herself. It means you develop a skill for reading people without them noticing you're doing it. It means you hear things you're not supposed to hear because people forget you're in the room. It means you can predict what someone wants before they ask for it, and they never wonder how you knew. It means you're always performing a version of yourself that's designed to be forgettable. That sounds exhausting, David observed. It is, Deborah admitted. But it's also safe. Nobody hurts you if they don't really see you. The words hung in the air between them, more revealing than she'd intended. David set down his coffee carefully, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle. Who hurt you, Deborah? She could have deflected, could have retreated behind the professional mask she'd worn for 7 years. But they were building something here, even if it was fake, and it needed to be built on at least some truth. My father left when I was 8, she said. Just walked out one day and never came back. My mother tried to explain it. He wasn't ready for a family, he had his own problems, it wasn't about us. But I was 8, and the only thing I understood was that I wasn't enough to make him stay. So, I learned to be less visible, less demanding, less there. I thought if I could just figure out how to be the right amount of present without being too much, people would stay. Did it work? David asked. No, Deborah said simply. People leave anyway. But at least when you're invisible, it hurts less when they do. David was quiet for a long moment, and Deborah wondered if she'd said too much, revealed too many cracks in the professional facade she was supposed to maintain. But when he finally spoke, his voice held understanding rather than pity. My mother died when I was 12, he said. Cancer. My father remarried within a year, a socialite half his age who saw me as an inconvenience to her new lifestyle. My grandfather tried to fill the gap, but he was busy running the family business, and I was angry at my mother for dying, At my father for replacing her so quickly, at the world for continuing to turn when mine had stopped. So I disappeared into computers and coding, building worlds I could control when everything else felt chaotic. Is that why you started Ashford Industries? Deborah asked. Partly, David admitted. But also because I wanted to prove to my grandfather that I could build something meaningful, something that would outlast me. He thought I was wasting my life on technology, that I should have gone into the family business like every Ashford for 3 generations. We've been fighting about it for 20 years. And now you're dying, or pretending to die, and suddenly he cares about you settling down, Deborah said, pieces clicking into place. This isn't just about inheritance. It's about finally getting his approval. David's smile was rueful. You're perceptive. That's going to make this either much easier or much harder. Why harder? Because you'll see through me too easily, David said. And I'm not sure I'm ready for that. They spent the morning in strange domesticity, David showing her around the house, pointing out which rooms he actually used versus which ones were just for show. The master bedroom was surprisingly sparse, more like a hotel room than a home. The kitchen was clearly Catherine's domain, fully stocked and obviously used. But it was the office that revealed the most about David. Walls lined with whiteboards covered in equations and diagrams, a desk buried under papers and empty coffee cups, windows overlooking the ocean that he'd covered with blackout shades so he could work at any hour. I thought billionaires hired people to do the actual work, Deborah observed, taking in the organized chaos. I do, David said. But I can't stop myself from being involved in everything. Catherine says I have control issues. Catherine sounds smart. She is. Too smart to work for me, honestly, but she's been loyal since the beginning. David moved to one of the whiteboards, erasing a section of equations. This is where I spend most of my time. This and the office in Manhattan. I'm not very good at relaxing. What do you do for fun? Deborah asked. David looked genuinely stumped by the question. I work. That's not fun. That's just more work. It doesn't feel like work when you love it, David said defensively. Deborah moved closer to the whiteboard, studying the complex equations she didn't understand. What is this? Machine learning algorithm for predictive data analysis, David said. We're working on a system that can anticipate market trends before they happen. It's complicated. And you enjoy this? This makes you happy? David considered the question seriously. It makes me feel useful. Like I'm solving puzzles that matter. Is that the same as happy? I don't know, Deborah admitted. I'm not sure I know what happy feels like anymore. Satisfied, maybe. Accomplished. But happy. She shook her head. That feels like something other people get to feel. They stood together in the office, 2 people who'd spent their lives in different kinds of invisibility, his behind walls of wealth and accomplishment, hers behind walls of service and strategic forgetting. For a moment, something passed between them that felt almost like recognition. We're both kind of broken, aren't we? David said quietly. Maybe, Deborah replied. Or maybe we're just honest about the cracks. The afternoon brought new challenges. Catherine arrived with a stylist named Philip who talked a mile a minute while pulling outfit after outfit from garment bags that seemed to contain infinite possibilities. David tells me we're building a wardrobe from scratch, Philip said, circling Deborah with a critical eye that made her want to hide. Nothing too drastic. We want you to look elevated but authentic. Someone who'd catch David's eye but wouldn't seem like you're trying too hard. Effortless elegance with an edge of independence. Can you walk for me? Deborah walked across the room, feeling absurdly self-conscious. Philip hummed thoughtfully, then started draping fabrics over her shoulders, holding up different colors against her skin, muttering about undertones and season palettes. She's stunning, he announced to David, as if Deborah weren't standing right there. Bone structure for days. And that skin? We're playing that up. Rich jewel tones, emerald, sapphire, burgundy. Classic silhouettes with modern details. She needs to look like she belongs in your world without losing herself in it. For the next 2 hours, Deborah tried on more clothes than she'd owned in her entire life. Evening gowns and cocktail dresses, casual wear that probably cost more than her monthly rent, shoes that made her feel like she was walking on stilts. Philip and Catherine conferred in low voices while David watched from an armchair, his expression unreadable. How do you feel? David asked when Philip finally released her for a break. Deborah looked down at the emerald dress she was wearing, silk that flowed like water, cut to fit her perfectly, making her look like someone she didn't recognize in the mirror. Like I'm playing dress-up in someone else's closet. You look beautiful, David said, and something in his voice made her look up sharply. He held her gaze for a moment, then glanced away. The dress, I mean. Philip knows what he's doing. But Deborah had caught the flicker of something in his eyes, something that looked almost like genuine appreciation, and it unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. This was supposed to be business. She was supposed to be playing a role. But the way David had looked at her in that moment had felt decidedly UN businesslike. Evening brought a new test. Catherine had prepared dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta and salad, and she'd set the table on the terrace overlooking the ocean. David opened a bottle of wine, and they sat across from each other while the sun set in shades of orange and pink that looked like something from a painting. This is nice, Deborah said, surprised to find she meant it. It is, David agreed. I can't remember the last time I had dinner out here. Usually, I just eat in my office while I work. That's sad, Deborah said bluntly. Is it? David twirled pasta on his fork. I always thought it was efficient. Efficiency isn't the same as living, Deborah pointed out. You're supposed to enjoy your life, not just survive it productively. David laughed, the sound startled and genuine. You sound like my therapist again. Maybe you should listen to your therapist. Maybe I should listen to you, David said, and this time when their eyes met, neither of them looked away. The moment stretched, fragile and strange, until Catherine appeared to clear their plates and the spell broke. But something had shifted between them, some wall beginning to crumble in ways that both excited and terrified Deborah. After dinner, they moved to the living room, and David pulled up a slideshow on the enormous television mounted above the fireplace. Homework, he announced. These are photos of my family, my grandfather, my father, my stepmother, various cousins, and aunts and uncles. You need to be able to recognize them and know at least basic information about each one. My grandfather will expect you to know who everyone is. For the next hour, Deborah studied faces and memorized names, learning that David's grandfather Charles had built Ashford Enterprises from nothing, that his father Richard was on his third marriage and mostly uninvolved in David's life, that there were 17 cousins spread across 3 continents, all of whom would probably attend the wedding. This is a lot of people to keep track of, Deborah said, rubbing her temples. I know, David replied. And most of them only show up when they want something. But Charles will expect you to treat them all like family, so we need to make it convincing. What about your brother? Deborah asked, remembering the background story, mentioned someone named Marcus. David's expression shuttered. What about him? You haven't mentioned him. Is he part of this equation? Marcus is complicated, David said carefully. He's 5 years younger than me, and has spent his entire life trying to prove he's as good as me. He works for Ashford Industries, but he reports to the board, not to me. We're not close. Will he be at the wedding? Yes, David said flatly. And he'll probably try to cause problems. Marcus doesn't like being overshadowed, and marrying you will give me exactly what my grandfather wants, which means Marcus will see it as me winning again. Winning what? Deborah asked. Everything, David said. In Marcus's mind, life is a competition, and I'm always ahead. It's exhausting. Deborah thought about the background story, about a brother who might see through their arrangement and cause complications. Should I be worried about him? Just be careful, David said. Marcus is charming when he wants to be, but is also calculating. He'll try to befriend you, probably try to get information about our relationship. Don't trust him. The warning hung in the air as David returned to the slideshow, moving through more family members and their various allegiances and rivalries. Deborah tried to focus, but her mind kept drifting back to David's shuttered expression when he talked about his brother, the way his whole body had tensed. This family, she was beginning to realize, was as complicated and dysfunctional as any she'd encountered. Money didn't insulate you from drama, it just made the stakes higher and the weapons more expensive. By the time the car came to take her back to Manhattan, Deborah's head was spinning with information and impressions. David walked her to the door, and in the dim light of the entryway, he looked younger and more uncertain than she'd seen him. Thank you for today, he said. I know this is all strange and probably overwhelming. But you're doing great. I'm just memorizing names and trying on dresses, Deborah replied. The hard part comes later. The hard part is convincing my grandfather we're actually in love, David corrected. Everything else is just logistics. Deborah looked up at him, at this man who had everything but felt like he had nothing, and felt a flicker of something she didn't want to examine too closely. How will we know if we're convincing enough? David reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she wanted to, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was gentle, almost tender, and it made Deborah's breath catch. Because it won't feel like pretending anymore, he said softly. Then he stepped back, the moment broken, and Deborah fled to the waiting car before she could do something stupid like admit that parts of today had already stopped feeling like pretending. The drive back to Manhattan gave her too much time to think. About David's careful touches and careful words. About the way she'd caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. About how easy it had been to talk to him, to let down some of her carefully constructed walls. This was supposed to be business. A transaction. 6 weeks of her life in exchange for financial freedom. But business didn't make your heart race when someone tucked your hair behind your ear. Business didn't make you wonder what it would feel like if the pretending became real. Deborah pulled out her phone and opened the Notes app, typing out a reminder to herself. Don't forget this is fake. Don't forget he's paying you. Don't forget that in 6 weeks, you walk away. But even as she typed the words, she wondered if she was already too late to heed her own warning. The announcement hit the internet like a bomb. Deborah was restocking supplies in the Sterling Club's back room when her phone started buzzing incessantly. Text messages from numbers she didn't recognize, notifications from social media apps she rarely used, missed calls piling up faster than she could dismiss them. Her hands shook as she pulled up the first notification, and there it was, a press release from Ashford Industries, complete with a photo she didn't remember being taken. David Ashford, CEO of Ashford Industries, is pleased to announce his engagement to Deborah Smith. The couple met at New York's Sterling Club and have been dating privately for the past 3 months. They plan to marry in an intimate ceremony next week. The photo showed them on David's terrace during dinner, the sunset painting everything gold. She was laughing at something, her head tilted back, and David was watching her with an expression that looked almost real. Deborah stared at that expression, trying to remember what he'd said to make her laugh like that, trying to reconcile the tenderness in his eyes with their business arrangement. Her phone rang. David. Tell me you're somewhere private, he said without preamble. I'm in the supply room at work, Deborah replied, her voice tight. David, my phone won't stop. I know. Mine either. Catherine is fielding media requests, and my publicist has already received 300 interview requests. This is moving faster than we anticipated. He paused. How are you holding up? Deborah looked at her phone screen, watching new notifications pile up in real time. I'm not sure. This is a lot. Can you get away from the club? I'm sending a car. We need to get you somewhere secure before the media figures out where you work. They'll be at the Sterling Club within the hour. As if summoned by his words, Deborah heard commotion from the main dining room, raised voices, the manager's firm tone trying to restore order. She cracked the supply room door and peered out to see photographers crowding the entrance, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions at the staff. They're already here, Deborah whispered into the phone. David cursed. Stay where you are. I'm calling the club's security. Don't come out until someone you trust comes to get you. The next 20 minutes were chaos. The club's manager, a stern woman named Patricia who'd never shown Deborah much warmth, appeared at the supply room door with 2 security guards. Miss Smith, she said, her tone now respectful in a way it had never been before. We need to get you out of here. There's a service exit that leads to the garage. Mr. Ashford's car is waiting. Deborah followed them through the maze of back hallways, past curious kitchen staff and other servers who stared at her with expressions ranging from shock to envy. She caught sight of herself in a mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back, eyes wide with panic, still wearing her server's uniform, about to be hustled into a billionaire's car like some kind of celebrity. The black car was indeed waiting, and this time Catherine was inside, her usual composure slightly ruffled. Slide down, Catherine instructed as soon as Deborah was in the car. They've got photographers on every exit. Deborah crouched in the footwell, feeling ridiculous and terrified in equal measure, while the car navigated out of the garage. Only when they were several blocks away did Catherine give her permission to sit up properly. Welcome to life with David Ashford, Catherine said dryly. It's always this subtle. They drove to David's Manhattan penthouse, a space Deborah hadn't seen before. It was smaller than the Hamptons' house, but no less impressive, all windows and modern art and furniture that looked sculptural. David was pacing in front of those windows, phone pressed to his ear, still in the middle of what sounded like a tense conversation. "I don't care about the optics," he was saying. "My private life is my private life, and they don't get to," he spotted Deborah and immediately softened. "I have to go. Handle it however you think best." He hung up and crossed to her in 3 long strides. "Are you okay? They didn't hurt you?" "I'm fine," Deborah said, though her hands were still shaking. "Just overwhelmed." David guided her to the couch, his hand warm on her lower back. The gesture felt natural now after their day together, which should have been comforting, but instead felt dangerous. "I'm sorry. I should have anticipated this level of response. I forget sometimes that my life isn't normal." "Your life is definitely not normal," Deborah agreed, accepting the glass of water Catherine handed her. "I've never been chased by photographers before." "You'll need to get used to it," Catherine said, settling into a chair across from them. "At least for the next few weeks. After the wedding, interest will die down somewhat, but until then, you're the most fascinating woman in America, the mysterious waitress who captured David Ashford's heart." The description made Deborah's stomach twist. "I'm not mysterious. I'm just private." "Same thing to the media," Catherine replied. "They've already dug up your high school yearbook photo, by the way. It's circulating on Twitter. You had braces and a truly unfortunate haircut." Deborah groaned. "I was 16. Everyone looks terrible at 16. "The internet disagrees," Catherine said, pulling up her tablet. "Look, even in high school, Deborah Smith was stunning." "You're getting a very positive response, actually. People seem to like that you're normal, that you worked an honest job. There's a whole thread about how refreshing it is that David chose someone real instead of another socialite." David leaned over to look at the tablet, and his expression darkened. "They're also speculating about whether I'm dying. Apparently, someone leaked information about my supposed brain tumor." "That was bound to happen," Catherine said pragmatically. "Though we might want to address it head-on rather than let rumors spiral. I can schedule a press conference, have you both make a statement about." "No," David interrupted. "No press conferences. We're keeping this private." "You made it public when you announced your engagement," Catherine pointed out. "You don't get to control the narrative without engaging with the media at least somewhat." Deborah watched them argue, feeling increasingly out of her depth. This was David's world: press conferences and narrative control and managing public perception. She was just along for the ride, a prop in his elaborate performance. Except it hadn't felt like a performance yesterday on the terrace. It had felt real. "What do you think, Deborah?" David asked suddenly, pulling her from her thoughts. "About what?" "About doing a press conference. Catherine thinks we should get ahead of the story. I think we should maintain our privacy. You're the one who's actually going to have to stand in front of cameras and answer questions. What do you want to do?" The fact that he was asking her opinion, treating her like an equal partner rather than an employee, made something warm unfold in Deborah's chest. "I think Catherine's right. People are going to speculate regardless. We might as well control what information gets out there." David studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay. Catherine, set it up. But nothing invasive. Basic questions only, and we cut it off after 15 minutes. Catherine was already typing on her tablet. "I'll schedule it for tomorrow afternoon. That gives us time to prep and for Deborah to work with our media coach." "Media coach?" Deborah repeated faintly. "You'll need one," Catherine said matter-of-factly. "The press will try to trip you up, get you to contradict David's story or reveal something personal. You need to learn how to deflect, how to stay on message, how to look relaxed when you're terrified." "I'm starting to understand why David pays you so much," Deborah muttered. Catherine's smile was sharp. "I'm worth every penny." The rest of the day was a crash course in media management. A woman named Diane arrived, David's media coach, apparently, and proceeded to pepper Deborah with increasingly invasive questions while filming her responses. "When did you know you were in love with David? What will you do with his money when he dies? How does it feel to go from serving billionaires to marrying one? Are you pregnant?" Each question made Deborah's blood pressure spike, but Diane was relentless, pushing her to maintain composure, to deflect without seeming evasive, to smile when she wanted to snap. The key, Diane explained during a break, is to remember that you don't owe them anything. You answer what you're comfortable answering, and you redirect everything else back to your relationship with David. They want drama, but you're giving them romance. They want scandal, but you're giving them a love story. But it's not a real love story, Deborah said quietly, glancing at David, who was watching from across the room. Doesn't matter, Diane replied. What matters is that they believe it is. And the only way they'll believe it is if you believe it yourself, at least while the cameras are rolling. By the time Diane left, Deborah's head was pounding and her face hurt from holding fake smiles. David dismissed Catherine for the evening, and suddenly they were alone in the penthouse, the city lights glittering through the windows like a galaxy. I'm sorry about all of this, David said, pouring them both whiskey without asking if she wanted any. I knew it would be intense, but I didn't really prepare you for how intense. Deborah accepted the glass, letting the whiskey burn down her throat. I signed up for this. I knew what I was getting into. Did you? David moved to stand beside her at the window. Because I'm not sure I did, and this is my life. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the city breathe below them. Deborah could feel the warmth radiating from David's body, could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Tell me something true, David said suddenly, echoing the game they'd started yesterday. Something real about how you're feeling right now. Deborah considered lying, maintaining the professional distance that had kept her safe for 7 years. But she was tired of lying, tired of pretending, even though pretending was literally her job right now. I'm scared, she admitted. Not of the cameras or the questions. I'm scared that I'm going to forget this is fake. That I'm going to start believing the story we're telling, and when it ends, I'm going to be hurt in ways I promised myself I'd never be hurt again. David turned to face her fully, and his expression was so raw it made her chest ache. I'm scared of the same thing. Except I'm not sure I'm still pretending. The words hung between them, dangerous and electric. Deborah's heart hammered against her ribs as David reached up slowly, giving her time to step back, to remind him this was business, to maintain the boundaries they'd agreed upon. She didn't step back. His hand cupped her cheek, thumb brushing across her cheekbone with a gentleness that made her eyes sting. Deborah, he said softly, her name a question and a confession all at once. This is a bad idea, she whispered, but she didn't move away. Terrible idea, David agreed, and then he was kissing her. It wasn't the careful, performative kiss Deborah had imagined they'd need to master for public appearances. This was real, desperate and searching, like two people who'd been drowning finally gasping for air. David's hand slid into her hair, and Deborah's found his shirt, pulling him closer even as her mind screamed that this was breaking every rule they'd established. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, David rested his forehead against hers. That was, he started. A mistake, Deborah finished, trying to ignore how much she wanted to kiss him again. I was going to say inevitable, David said. But mistake works too. Deborah stepped back, needing distance to think clearly. David, we can't do this. We have a contract. An arrangement. If we blur the lines, someone's going to get hurt. Someone's already getting hurt, David said quietly. I've been falling for you since that first night in the coffee shop, and I don't know how to stop. You have to stop, Deborah said, her voice shaking. Because in 6 weeks, I'm walking away with my money, and you're going to move on with your life, and none of this will have been real. What if I don't want you to walk away? David asked. The question froze Deborah in place. What? What if I'm done pretending? David moved closer again, and this time Deborah did step back. What if I told you that every moment we've spent together has felt more real than anything in my life? What if I asked you to consider making this actually real? Then I'd say you're confusing gratitude with love, Deborah said, forcing steel into her voice even as her heart raced. I'm not like the women in your world, David. I don't belong at charity galas and society weddings. I'm a waitress from Washington Heights who's playing dress-up in your life. When the novelty wears off, you'll realize that. You're not a waitress, David said intensely. You're brilliant and observant and real in ways no one I've ever met has been real. You see through all the bullshit, and you're not afraid to call me on mine. That's not novelty. That's exactly what I've been looking for my entire life. You're paying me $2 million to pretend to love you, Deborah reminded him, hating how much the words hurt to say. Everything between us is transactional. Don't romanticize it into something it's not. David flinched as if she'd slapped him. Right. Of course. The contract. The arrangement. How could I forget? He turned away, and Deborah watched his shoulders tense, watched him rebuild the walls she'd briefly seen crumble. Part of her wanted to take back her words, to admit that she'd been falling too, that the kiss had felt like coming home. But the smarter part, the part that had learned to protect herself at 8 years old when her father walked away, kept her silent. I should go, Deborah said quietly. Catherine will arrange a car, David replied without turning around. And she'll pick you up tomorrow morning for the press conference. Try to get some sleep. Deborah waited for him to say something else, to turn around and fight for what he'd just confessed. But David remained at the window, silhouetted against the city lights, looking more alone than anyone should look in a penthouse worth $50 million. The car ride back to her apartment gave Deborah too much time to second-guess herself. Her lips still tingled from David's kiss, and her body still hummed with the electricity of his touch. She'd pushed him away because it was smart. After all, getting involved would only lead to heartbreak. But smart didn't feel very comforting when she was alone in her tiny apartment, staring at the ceiling and reliving the moment David had cupped her face like she was something precious. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Catherine. The car will pick you up at 8 a.m. Wear the navy dress Philip selected. And Deborah? Whatever happened between you and David tonight, fix it before the press conference. You two need to look in love, not like you've been fighting. Deborah typed back, how did you know we fought? Catherine's response came immediately. I've worked for David for 12 years. I know when something's wrong. Figure it out. You're both too smart to let this fall apart over feelings. But feelings, Deborah thought, were exactly the problem. She'd signed up for fake. She'd agreed to pretend. She hadn't agreed to actually fall for David Ashford, and she definitely hadn't planned on him falling for her. She pulled out the contract she'd signed, reading through the clinical language that outlined their arrangement. 6 weeks. $2 million. No expectation of a continued relationship beyond the agreed-upon timeline. Everything was spelled out in black and white, clear as day. Except nothing felt clear anymore. The lines had blurred despite her best efforts, and now she was supposed to stand in front of cameras tomorrow and convince the world she was in love with a man she'd just pushed away. Deborah's phone rang again. David. She stared at his name on the screen, her thumb hovering over the answer button. She could ignore it, could let the moment pass and deal with the awkwardness tomorrow. Or she could answer and face whatever needed to be said. She answered. I'm sorry, David said immediately. For pushing. For kissing you without asking first. For putting you in an impossible position. You did ask, Deborah said quietly. Just not with words. Still. This is already complicated enough without me making it worse. He paused, and she heard him take a shaky breath. But I meant what I said, Deborah. About falling for you. I understand if you can't reciprocate, if you want to keep this strictly business. But I needed you to know that for me, at least, it stopped being business somewhere between the terrace and today. Deborah closed her eyes, torn between what she wanted and what was safe. David. You don't have to say anything, he interrupted gently. I just wanted you to know where I stand. Tomorrow, we'll go out there and perform our roles perfectly. We'll convince everyone we're in love. And if that's all this ever is, a performance, then I'll accept that. But if there's even a chance that you feel a fraction of what I feel, I want you to know that I'm willing to tear up the contract. All of it. The money, the timeline, the arrangement. I want you to stay not because I'm paying you, but because you want to. The offer hung in the air, tempting and terrifying. $2 million or the possibility of something real with a man who was supposed to be temporary. I can't answer that right now, Deborah said finally. I need time to think. Take all the time you need, David said. Just promise me you won't disappear. Whatever you decide, promise me you'll see this through to the end. I promise, Deborah said, and meant it. After they hung up, Deborah sat in the darkness of her apartment, trying to untangle the mess of emotions knotted in her chest. She'd spent 7 years being invisible, protecting herself by never letting anyone see the real her. But David had seen her anyway, had seen past the professional mask to the woman underneath who wanted more than she'd allowed herself to want. And now he was offering her exactly what she'd always been afraid to reach for: the chance to be fully visible, fully seen, fully loved. The question was whether she was brave enough to take it. The navy dress fit perfectly, as everything Philip selected did. Deborah stared at herself in the mirror of David's penthouse guest room, trying to recognize the woman looking back at her. Her natural hair had been styled into elegant curls that framed her face, her makeup was subtle but polished, and the dress made her look like she belonged in David's world. But inside, she still felt like the waitress from Washington Heights, playing a role she wasn't sure she could sustain. Catherine knocked once before entering, her expression all business. "You look perfect." David's finishing up with his own prep. "The press conference is at 2, which gives us 3 hours to review talking points and make sure you're both on the same page." She paused, studying Deborah's face. "Did you fix it?" "I don't know," Deborah admitted. "We talked. But I'm not sure anything's actually fixed." "Then fake it until it's real," Catherine said pragmatically. "That's what you're being paid for, isn't it?" The words stung, probably because they were true. Deborah had signed up to fake a relationship, to play a role convincingly enough to fool David's grandfather and satisfy an inheritance clause. The fact that real feelings had gotten tangled up in the arrangement didn't change the fundamental nature of their deal. Except that David had offered to change it. Had offered to tear up the contract and make this real. Deborah found David in his office, reviewing notes on his tablet. He looked up when she entered, and something flickered across his face: appreciation, longing, carefully controlled desire. Then he schooled his expression into professional neutrality. "You look beautiful," he said carefully, like he was testing whether they were still allowed to give each other compliments. "Philip's work," Deborah replied, maintaining the same careful distance. "I'm just the mannequin." "You're not a mannequin," David said quietly. "And we both know Philip didn't make you beautiful. He just helped you look like you feel." The words created a crack in the wall Deborah had been trying to build between them. Before she could respond, Catherine appeared in the doorway. "Time to review," she announced. "Deborah, sit next to David. You need to look comfortable together, which means you need to actually be comfortable together." For the next hour, Catherine drilled them on their story, asking the same questions from different angles, making sure their answers aligned perfectly. When did they fall in love? What was their first date? How did David propose? Each answer had been carefully crafted to be romantic but vague enough to discourage follow-up questions. But the question Catherine kept coming back to was the one that made Deborah's stomach twist. Why do you love him? Each time she asked it, Deborah gave the rehearsed answer they'd agreed upon. Something about David's intelligence, his passion for his work, the way he saw the world. The words were true, technically, but they felt hollow, like she was describing a character in a book rather than a real person. "You sound like you're reading a script," Catherine said finally, her frustration evident. "Deborah, you need to sound genuine. What do you actually love about David?" The room went silent. David looked up from his tablet, his dark eyes meeting Deborah's, and she saw the question there too. Not what she was supposed to say for the cameras, but what she actually felt. "I love that he listens," Deborah said slowly, the truth spilling out before she could stop it. "Really listens, not just waits for his turn to talk. I love that he's brilliant but doesn't make other people feel stupid. I love that he works too hard and forgets to eat lunch and thinks efficiency is more important than enjoying his life, because it means he cares deeply about things that matter." She paused, her eyes still locked with David's. "I love that he sees me. Actually, sees me, not just the role I'm playing or the service I'm providing. He sees me, and he doesn't look away." The silence that followed was thick with things unsaid. Catherine was staring at her with an expression Deborah couldn't quite read: surprise, maybe, or concern. But David's face had softened into something that looked almost like hope. "That's good," Catherine said finally, her voice rough. "Use that." That sounded real. Because it was real, Deborah thought, but didn't say. They arrived at the hotel conference room 20 minutes before the scheduled start, giving David's publicist time to review the final details. The room was already filling with reporters and photographers, their equipment creating a wall of cameras and microphones that made Deborah's breath catch. "This is insane," she whispered to David as they waited in the wings. "Welcome to my world," he replied. Then, more softly, "You can still back out. Say you're sick, we'll reschedule, give you more time to prepare." "I'm not backing out," Deborah said firmly. "I made a promise. I keep my promises. David's hand found hers, his fingers interlacing with her own. Then let's give them a show. They walked out together, and the camera flashes were blinding. David guided her to the table set up at the front of the room, his hand warm on her lower back, and Deborah tried to remember everything Diane had taught her. Smile but not too much, make eye contact but don't stare, sit up straight but appear relaxed. David's publicist, a polished woman named Jennifer, stepped up to the microphone first. Thank you all for coming. Mr. Ashford and Ms. Smith will make a brief statement and then take questions for 15 minutes. Please keep your questions respectful. David stood, and suddenly the room went quiet. Deborah watched him command the space with effortless authority, understanding for the first time why he'd been so successful so young. He had presence, the kind that made people listen even before he spoke. I know there's been a lot of speculation about my personal life over the past 24 hours, David began, his voice steady and clear. So I wanted to set the record straight. Yes, I'm engaged to Deborah Smith. Yes, we've been dating for 3 months. And no, I'm not dying. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. David held up a hand for silence. The rumors about a brain tumor are false. I'm in perfect health, and I plan to be for a very long time. Those rumors were started by someone trying to undermine my position at Ashford Industries, and I won't dignify them with further discussion. He paused, and when he continued, his voice had softened. What I will discuss is how lucky I am to have found Deborah. She's intelligent, compassionate, and real in ways that are rare in my world. She sees through all the noise and pretense to what actually matters. And I can't wait to spend my life with her. He sat down and reached for Deborah's hand, and the gesture felt so natural that she almost forgot they were performing. Then Jennifer opened the floor to questions, and the real test began. Deborah, how does it feel to go from being a waitress to marrying one of the richest men in America? The question was designed to make her sound like a gold digger, but Deborah had practiced for this. She smiled and leaned slightly toward the microphone. I'm not marrying David because of his money, she said clearly. I'm marrying him because of who he is when all the money and success are stripped away. The man who tips generously and remembers his server's name. The man who works too hard because he genuinely cares about his employees. The man who's brave enough to be vulnerable. She squeezed David's hand. That's who I fell in love with. The next question came rapid fire. David, why Deborah? What made her different from all the other women you've dated? David didn't hesitate. Deborah never wanted anything from me except to be left alone to do her job. She wasn't trying to network or impress me. She was just herself, professional, kind, brilliant. In a world where everyone wants something, she was the first person in years who just wanted me to enjoy my dinner and leave her a decent tip. He smiled, and it looked genuine. That's incredibly attractive. Deborah, are you pregnant? The question made Deborah's jaw tighten, but she'd expected it. No. Next question. David, what does your family think about this engagement? This was trickier territory. David's expression remained neutral, but Deborah felt his hand tense slightly in hers. My grandfather is thrilled, David said smoothly. He's been encouraging me to settle down for years, and he's excited to meet Deborah at our wedding next week. As for the rest of my family, I'm sure they'll be equally supportive once they get to know her. A reporter in the front row raised her hand. There are rumors that this engagement is related to your grandfather's health and his will. Can you address those concerns? Deborah felt David's entire body go rigid. This was the question they'd been dreading, the one that hit too close to the truth. My grandfather's health is a private family matter, David said, his voice cooler now. But I'll say this, I'm not marrying Deborah because of inheritance or family pressure. I'm marrying her because I love her. The timing might seem convenient to people looking for scandal, but sometimes life just works out that way. I found the right person at the right time, and I'm not going to apologize for that. Deborah jumped in before the reporter could follow up. If you're suggesting I'm marrying David for money, you're wrong. I have my own dreams and my own plans. David supports those dreams, and that's worth more than any inheritance. The reporters seemed satisfied with that, moving on to softer questions about wedding plans and where they'd live. Deborah answered on autopilot, describing a small, intimate ceremony that was actually happening in 5 days, mentioning that they'd probably split time between David's Hamptons house and his Manhattan penthouse, careful not to mention her studio apartment in Washington Heights that she'd be giving up. 15 minutes felt like 15 hours, but finally Jennifer called time and ushered them off the stage. The moment they were behind closed doors, David released Deborah's hand and stepped away, running his fingers through his hair. "That was brutal," he said. "You were perfect," Catherine said, appearing beside them with her ever-present tablet. "Both of you. The clips are already going viral, mostly positive responses. People love the whole love in the face of adversity narrative. And Deborah, your comment about David being vulnerable? Brilliant. It humanized him in exactly the right way." "Because it was true," Deborah said quietly. Catherine looked between them, her expression thoughtful. "You two need to talk. Privately. I'll handle the follow-up with the press. David, take Deborah somewhere quiet and figure out whatever's going on between you, because if you don't, it's going to show at the wedding." She swept out before either of them could respond, leaving them alone in the small green room. David stood with his back to Deborah, his shoulders tense, and she could feel the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on them. "That question about the inheritance," David said finally, still not turning around. "That was Marcus. He's the only one outside of my lawyers who knew the specific details of my grandfather's will. He leaked it to the press." "Why would he do that?" Deborah asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "Because he wants me to fail," David said simply. "He wants this whole thing to blow up in my face so he can swoop in and take over when the board loses confidence in my leadership. He's been waiting for an opportunity like this for years." "Then we can't let him win," Deborah said firmly. David finally turned to face her, and his expression was raw. "Is that the only reason you're still here? Because you don't want my brother to win?" The question hung between them, loaded with everything they'd been dancing around since last night's kiss. Deborah could lie, could retreat into the safety of their business arrangement. Or she could be honest, could step fully into the terrifying vulnerability of being seen. "No," she said quietly. "That's not the only reason." David crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping just inches from her. "Then what's the real reason, Deborah? Because I need to know if I'm the only one feeling this. I need to know if there's any chance that what we have is more than just a well-executed performance." Deborah looked up at him, at this man who had everything but felt like he had nothing until she'd stumbled into his orbit. She thought about the careful walls she'd built over 29 years, the protection those walls had offered, and the loneliness they'd guaranteed. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "Of feeling too much. Of getting hurt when this ends. Of believing in something that might not be real." "It's real," David said intensely, his hands coming up to frame her face. "Deborah, this is the most real thing in my life. I know we started this as business, and I know you have every reason not to trust me. But I'm asking you to try. To give us a chance to figure out what this could be without the contract hanging over us." "What are you saying?" Deborah's heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm saying the contract is void if you want it to be," David said. "You still get the $2 million. I'll transfer it to your account today. You're free to walk away right now with no obligations. Or—" He paused, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "Or you can stay. Not as my fake wife, but as my real girlfriend. We can take this slow, figure out if what we're feeling is sustainable outside the pressure of the arrangement. Either way, you get the money. Either way, you get your freedom. The only difference is whether you choose to spend that freedom with me." Deborah's breath caught. He was offering her everything, the security she'd been working toward for 7 years and the possibility of something more. No strings, no pressure, just a choice. "That's not fair," she whispered. "Why not?" "Because it's too easy to say yes when you're offering me everything I want." David's smile was soft, almost sad. "Then say no. Tell me this is just business, walk away with your money, and I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been if you'd been brave enough to try." The words hit like a challenge, and something in Deborah rose to meet it. She'd spent her whole life being careful, being safe, protecting herself from the possibility of being hurt. And where had it gotten her? 7 years of invisible service, a studio apartment with walls she could touch from the center, and a carefully curated loneliness that had started to feel more like a prison than protection. "I want to try," Deborah said, the words tumbling out before she could overthink them. "I want to see what this could be without the contract, without the performance. But David, if we do this, it has to be real. No more lies, no more strategic omissions. Just honesty, even when it's hard." "Especially when it's hard," David agreed. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to change her mind, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her eyes sting. This kiss was different from the desperate one last night. This was a promise, a beginning, a choice they were both making with open eyes. When they finally broke apart, David rested his forehead against hers and laughed shakily. So now what? Now we have to tell Catherine we're dating for real, Deborah said. She's going to kill us. She's going to say she knew all along, David corrected. Catherine has a sixth sense about these things. They found Catherine in the hotel lobby, already fielding calls from reporters requesting follow-up interviews. When she saw them walking toward her hand in hand, she ended her call and raised one perfectly groomed eyebrow. You figured it out, she said. It wasn't a question. We're dating, David said. For real. The contract is void, Deborah gets her money regardless, and we're going to see where this goes. Catherine studied them both for a long moment, and Deborah braced for objections, for warnings about mixing business with personal feelings. Instead, Catherine smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her usually professional expression. About time, she said. You've both been miserable pretending this was fake. Now at least you can be honestly confused about your feelings like normal people. She pulled out her tablet, already adjusting plans. This actually makes things easier from a PR standpoint. Real relationships photograph better than fake ones. But Deborah, you need to be prepared. Dating David for real means dealing with everything that comes with his public life. The scrutiny, the pressure, the constant attention. It's not going to be easy. I know, Deborah said. But I'm starting to think easy isn't what I want anymore. Good, Catherine said. Because you're about to have the least easy week of your life. The wedding is in 5 days, David's grandfather arrives tomorrow for a pre-wedding dinner, and Marcus is already circling like a shark smelling blood. You two need to be solid, because this is only going to get harder before it gets easier. David's hand tightened on Deborah's. We'll handle it. See that you do, Catherine said. Because if this falls apart, it's not just your heart on the line, David. It's 40,000 jobs and a company you've spent 15 years building. The stakes are higher than they've ever been. The reminder sobered them both. This wasn't just about their feelings anymore. It was about protecting David's company from his brother's ambitions and proving to his grandfather that he was capable of commitment. The fact that their feelings were now real didn't change the external pressures they were facing. They rode back to David's penthouse in silence, both processing the magnitude of what they'd just committed to. When they arrived, David pulled Deborah onto the terrace where they'd had dinner that first day, when everything had still been simple and transactional. I need you to understand something, David said, his voice serious. What I said in there about the contract being void, I meant it. The money is yours regardless of what happens between us. If we try this and it doesn't work out, if you decide tomorrow that this was a mistake, you still get the $2 million. I won't hold you to anything. That's a terrible business decision, Deborah pointed out. This stopped being business the moment I kissed you, David replied. Maybe even before that. Maybe it stopped being business when I first asked you to dinner and realized I was hoping you'd say yes for reasons that had nothing to do with my grandfather's will. Deborah leaned against the railing, looking out at the ocean view that still felt surreal. What happens after the wedding? Do I move in here? Do I keep my apartment? What does dating a billionaire actually look like when it's real? I don't know, David admitted. I've never done this before, dated someone I actually care about. Usually it's all strategy and optics, making sure we look good together for the cameras. But with you. He moved to stand beside her. With you, I want messy. I want fights about whose turn it is to do dishes and disagreements about what to watch on Netflix. I want normal, even though nothing about our situation is normal. I can do messy, Deborah said, a smile tugging at her lips. I'm excellent at messy, actually. Good, David said, pulling her close. Because I have a feeling, we're about to get very good at it together. They stood on the terrace as the sun set, wrapped in each other's arms, and for the first time since this whole arrangement began, Deborah let herself feel hope. Not the careful, guarded hope she'd rationed out over 7 years of saving pennies, but the wild, unreasonable hope that maybe, just maybe, she deserved more than she'd allowed herself to want. David, she said quietly. Yeah. Thank you for seeing me. His arms tightened around her. Thank you for letting me. The restaurant David chose for the dinner with his grandfather was the kind of place where menus didn't have prices, and the sommelier probably earned more than Deborah had in her entire 7 years at the Sterling Club. Private dining room, crystal chandeliers, waiters who moved with the practiced invisibility Deborah recognized from her own years of service. She caught the eye of their server, a young black woman who couldn't have been more than 22, and saw her own past reflected back. "You, okay?" David asked quietly, his hand finding hers under the table. "Just remembering what it feels like to be on the other side," Deborah admitted. David's grandfather arrived precisely on time, because men like Charles Ashford didn't do anything imprecisely. He was 83 but carried himself like a man 20 years younger, all steel spine and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He wore a suit that had probably been tailored in London, and when he entered the private dining room, the air itself seemed to straighten up and pay attention. "Grandfather," David said, standing to greet him. "Thank you for coming." Charles ignored David's outstretched hand and instead pulled him into a brief, stiff embrace that spoke of years of complicated history. Then those sharp eyes turned to Deborah, and she felt herself being assessed with the thoroughness of someone who'd built an empire by reading people. "So, you're the woman who finally caught my grandson's attention," Charles said, his voice gravelly but strong. "Deborah Smith. The waitress." The way he said waitress wasn't quite contemptuous, but it wasn't exactly respectful either. Deborah felt David tense beside her, but she'd spent 7 years dealing with wealthy people who looked down on service workers. She knew how to handle this. "I prefer hospitality professional," Deborah said evenly, meeting Charles's gaze without flinching. "But yes, that's me. Though I'm currently between careers, I'm planning to open my own cafe in Brooklyn." "A cafe," Charles repeated, settling into his chair. "How quaint." "Practical," Deborah corrected. "Small businesses are the backbone of the American economy. I'm sure you remember that from when you started Ashford Enterprises in your garage." Charles's eyebrows rose slightly, and something that might have been approval flickered across his face. "You've done your research." "I always do my homework," Deborah replied. "It's how I've survived this long." David's hand squeezed hers under the table. Whether in warning or support, she wasn't sure. But Charles was smiling now, a sharp-edged expression that made him look more dangerous than friendly. "I like her," Charles announced to David. "She's got spine." "That's good. You need someone with a spine if you're going to survive this family." The dinner proceeded with a careful choreography of people who'd spent years navigating complicated relationships. Charles asked pointed questions about how they'd met, how long they'd been dating, and what their plans were for the future. Each question felt like a test, and Deborah could feel him probing for weaknesses in their story. But something had shifted since the press conference. Now that their feelings were real, or at least acknowledged, the lies felt less like lies and more like simplified versions of truth. Yes, they'd met at the Sterling Club. Yes, David had been coming there for years. Yes, something had finally clicked 3 months ago that made them both willing to take the risk of dating despite the complications. The only lie was the timeline, and even that felt more like strategic vagueness than outright deception. "So tell me, Deborah," Charles said when their entries arrived, "why do you love my grandson?" It was the same question Catherine had drilled her on, the one she'd practiced a dozen different ways. But sitting across from Charles Ashford, watching him dissect her every word and gesture, Deborah found herself abandoning the practiced response. "Because he's lonely," she said simply. "And so am I. We're both people who've spent too long being the version of ourselves that everyone else expects, and with each other, we get to be honest about how exhausting that is." The table went silent. David's hand tightened on hers, and when Deborah glanced at him, she saw surprise and something deeper, gratitude, maybe, or recognition. Charles studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he set down his fork and leaned back in his chair. "David's mother was lonely," he said finally. "My daughter. She married Richard because that's what was expected of her, good family, good connections, good optics. But she was miserable every day of that marriage, and when she died, I always wondered if some part of her was relieved." He paused, his eyes moving to David. "I don't want that for you. I don't want you to spend your life being what everyone expects instead of being happy." "I know, grandfather," David said quietly. "Do you?" Charles challenged. "Because from where I'm sitting, you've spent the last 15 years building a company at the expense of building a life. You work 18-hour days, you barely sleep, and the only time I see you is when there's a board meeting or a crisis. That's not living, David. That's just existing with better furniture." I'm trying to build something that matters, David said, his voice tight. Something that will outlast me. Isn't that what you always taught me, that legacy is what counts? I taught you that family is what counts, Charles corrected. Legacy is just another word for the people you leave behind who remember you fondly. And if you die alone in your office surrounded by quarterly reports, who's going to remember you as anything other than the brilliant workaholic who never figured out how to be happy? The words hit David visibly, and Deborah watched him struggle to respond. This was the conversation they'd been avoiding, the one about whether David's life had any meaning beyond Ashford Industries. That's why I'm marrying Deborah, David said finally. Because she reminds me that there's more to life than work. She makes me want to actually live instead of just survive productively. Charles turned his sharp gaze back to Deborah. Is that true? Does he make you want to live instead of just survive? The question was more perceptive than Deborah had expected, cutting straight to the heart of what she'd been doing for 7 years, surviving, not living. Playing it safe, staying invisible, protecting herself from the possibility of being hurt by never letting anyone close enough to hurt her. Yes, she said honestly. He scares me because he makes me want things I'd convinced myself I didn't need. But that's probably good for me. Safe isn't the same as happy. No, Charles agreed. It's really not. He picked up his wine glass, studying the deep red liquid. My wife, David's grandmother, died 20 years ago. Heart attack, completely unexpected. We'd been married for 45 years, and I thought I knew everything about her. But after she died, I found journals she'd kept, and I discovered she'd been miserable for the last decade of our marriage. Not because of me specifically, but because she felt invisible. Like she'd become just the wife of Charles Ashford instead of being Mary Elizabeth Ashford, her own person with her own dreams. He paused, and Deborah saw real pain flicker across his weathered face. I don't want that for you, Charles continued, looking at David. I don't want you to wake up 20 years from now and realize you've been so focused on building an empire that you forgot to build a partnership. Marriage isn't about having someone pretty on your arm at charity galas. It's about having someone who sees you, really sees you, and chooses you anyway, even when you're difficult and obsessive and sometimes insufferable. I am not insufferable, David protested, but there was affection in his voice. You absolutely are, Charles replied. You're brilliant and driven and utterly convinced you're right about everything. You got that from me, unfortunately. But Deborah seems like she's capable of calling you on your bullshit, which is exactly what you need. I'm getting better at that, Deborah said, surprising herself with her own boldness. Though it helps that he's occasionally willing to admit when he's wrong. Occasionally, David echoed dryly. That's generous. The tension that had filled the room earlier began to dissipate, replaced by something warmer. Charles asked about the wedding plans, seemed satisfied with the intimate ceremony they described, and even offered to host the reception at his estate in Connecticut if they wanted something more elaborate. We're keeping it simple, David said. Just close family and a few friends. Deborah and I both prefer private to spectacle. Smart, Charles approved. The media circus around your engagement has been exhausting enough. Though I'll admit that the press conference was well done. You two looked genuinely happy together. We are happy together, David said, and the truth in his voice made Deborah's chest tighten. Dessert arrived, some elaborate construction of chocolate and gold leaf that probably cost more than Deborah's monthly rent. As they ate, Charles regaled them with stories from the early days of Ashford Enterprises, back when he was young and hungry and stupid enough to think he could change the world. The thing about building something that lasts, Charles said, is that you have to be willing to evolve. The company I built 50 years ago looks nothing like Ashford Industries today, and that's good. If I'd insisted on keeping everything exactly as I designed it, we would have gone bankrupt 20 years ago. You have to be willing to adapt, to let go of control, to trust that the foundation you've built is strong enough to support new growth. He looked pointedly at David as he said this, and Deborah realized they weren't just talking about business anymore. I'm trying to learn that, David said quietly. The letting go part. It doesn't come naturally to me. It doesn't come naturally to any Ashford, Charles replied. We're control freaks by nature. But Deborah might be able to teach you, if you let her. After dinner, Charles insisted on walking them out to their car. At the curb, he pulled David aside for a private word while Deborah pretended to be interested in her phone. She's good for you, she heard Charles say. I can see it in your eyes. You look more alive than you have in years. Don't screw this up by being too proud or too stubborn to be vulnerable. That's what killed my marriage, David. Don't let it kill yours before it even starts. I won't, David promised. Charles turned to Deborah, and his expression softened in a way she hadn't seen all evening. Take care of him. He pretends he doesn't need anyone, but that's just Ashford pride talking. Everyone needs someone. I will, Deborah said, meaning it more than she'd expected. The drive back to David's penthouse was quiet, both of them processing the emotional weight of the evening. When they finally arrived, David poured them both whiskies, and they stood at the windows, looking out at Manhattan glittering below. That was intense, Deborah said finally. That was my grandfather on his best behavior, David replied. You should see him during board meetings. He once made a grown man cry over quarterly earnings report. He loves you, Deborah observed. It's obvious, even when he's being critical. I know, David said. That's what makes it complicated. If he didn't care, his disappointment wouldn't hurt so much. Deborah leaned into David's side, and his arm came around her automatically. He's not disappointed anymore. You heard him, he thinks I'm good for you. You are good for me, David said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. You make me want to be better. Not more successful or wealthier or more accomplished. Just better. More present. More honest. More willing to actually live my life instead of just managing it. That's a lot of pressure to put on one person, Deborah said, but she was smiling. Then it's a good thing you're exceptionally capable, David replied. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the city breathe below them. Deborah thought about Charles' warning about invisibility, about becoming just an appendage to someone else's life instead of living her own. It was a fear she understood viscerally. She'd spent 7 years making herself invisible at the Sterling Club, and part of her was terrified of disappearing into David's world the same way. David, she said quietly. Yeah. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me that if we do this, if we really make this relationship work, you won't let me disappear. I've spent too long being invisible, and I don't want to trade one kind of invisibility for another. David pulled back so he could look at her face, his expression serious. Deborah, you could never be invisible. You're too bright, too sharp, too fundamentally yourself. But I promise that I'll never ask you to be smaller or quieter or less than you are to fit into my world. If my world doesn't have room for all of you, then my world needs to expand. That's a good answer, Deborah said, her voice rough with emotion. I've been practicing, David admitted. Ever since you agreed to actually date me, I've been terrified of saying the wrong thing and scaring you away. I'm not that easy to scare, Deborah said. No. David's smile was soft. Because I've seen you face down reporters and my grandfather without flinching, but the moment things get emotionally real between us, you look like you're about to bolt. He wasn't wrong. Deborah had learned to handle external threats, hostile customers, invasive questions, and people who looked down on her because of her job. But emotional vulnerability? That was territory she'd spent years avoiding. Old habits, she said finally. When you've spent your whole life protecting yourself, it's hard to suddenly stop. Then don't stop all at once, David suggested. Just lower the walls a little bit at a time. Let me in gradually. I'm patient. Are you? Deborah teased. Because Catherine says you're the most impatient person she's ever met. I'm patient about things that matter, David corrected. And you matter more than anything else in my life right now. The declaration should have been terrifying, but instead Deborah felt something in her chest unclench. Here was this brilliant, successful, wealthy man, and he was choosing her. Not because she'd made herself convenient or undemanding or easy to overlook, but because she'd been authentically herself, prickly and cautious and unwilling to compromise on what mattered. The wedding is in 4 days, Deborah said, changing the subject before the emotion became overwhelming. Are you ready? To marry you? David's smile was genuine. Absolutely. To deal with my entire family descending on us for a weekend? Less enthusiastic about that part. Tell me about them, Deborah said. Not the rehearsed version for the media. The real version. They moved to the couch, and for the next hour, David painted a picture of his family that was more complicated and human than the polished images she'd memorized from photos. His father Richard, who'd remarried quickly after David's mother died and had never quite figured out how to parent his grieving 12-year-old son. His stepmother, Veronica, who tried to be kind but had been too young and overwhelmed to know how to connect with David. His younger brother Marcus, brilliant but bitter, is always competing but never quite measuring up. Marcus is going to be a problem at the wedding, David said. He'll smile and make nice for the cameras, but he'll find ways to undermine us. Little comments that sound innocent but plant seeds of doubt. Questions that seem reasonable but are designed to trap us into contradictions. Then we need to be prepared, Deborah said. What kind of questions would he ask? David thought for a moment. He'll probably target you directly. Ask about our relationship timeline. Try to find inconsistencies. He might ask about your financial situation. Make you feel defensive about the money. He'll definitely comment on how quickly everything happened. Suggest that it's suspicious. So, we stick to our story and don't let him rattle us, Deborah said. I can handle that. I know you can, David said. But I also need you to know that if Marcus says anything that makes you uncomfortable, you don't have to engage. You can walk away, and I'll support that decision completely. I'm not going to let your brother intimidate me, Deborah said firmly. I've dealt with difficult customers for 7 years. I know how to smile and deflect. David pulled her close, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while. Deborah found herself thinking about the wedding, about standing in front of David's entire family and promising to love him forever. When they'd first made this arrangement, those promises would have been lies. But now, what are you thinking about? David asked. The vows, Deborah admitted. When we get married, we're going to have to make promises to each other. And I know we're doing this for your grandfather and the inheritance, but David, I don't want to lie. Not about that. Not when it matters. David was quiet for a long moment. What if we wrote our own vows? Said what we actually mean instead of the standard ceremony script? What would you say? Deborah asked. David shifted so he could look at her properly. I'd say that you walked into my life when I'd convinced myself I didn't need anyone, and you proved me wrong. I'd say that you see through all my defenses and somehow still choose to stay. I'd say that I can't promise I'll always be easy to love, but I can promise I'll always be honest about how much I love you. He paused. What would you say? Deborah's throat was tight. I'd say that you made me brave. That you looked at me like I was someone worth seeing, worth knowing, worth choosing. I'd say that I'm terrified of needing you, but I'm more terrified of going back to the safe, lonely life I had before you offered me something dangerous and real. She took a shaky breath. I'd say that I love you, even though we've only known each other a few weeks, and I don't know if that's crazy or just honest. It's honest, David said, his voice rough. And for the record, I love you too. Not because of the arrangement or the wedding or any of the external circumstances. Just because you're you, and you're the first real thing in my life in longer than I can remember. They kissed, and this time there was no hesitation, no careful distance. This was two people choosing each other despite all the logical reasons they shouldn't, despite the complicated circumstances and the compressed timeline, and the fact that they were still learning each other's favorite foods and middle names. When they finally broke apart, David was smiling. So we'll write our own vows. Make real promises to each other. Real promises, Deborah agreed. In front of your entire family and everyone watching. Let them watch, David said. Let Marcus try to find the lie. He won't be able to, because there won't be one. Deborah thought about that, about standing in front of everyone and speaking truth instead of performance. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like the bravest thing she'd ever done. 4 days, she said. We have 4 days to figure out what promises we actually want to make to each other. Then we should probably spend those 4 days together, David said. Get to know each other beyond the rehearsed story. The real stuff, what makes you laugh, what makes you angry, what you dream about at 3 in the morning when you can't sleep. I dream about failure, Deborah admitted. Opening the cafe and watching it collapse because I'm not good enough, smart enough, prepared enough. I dream about being right back where I started, serving other people's dreams instead of building my own. And I dream about my mother, David said quietly. About what she'd think of who I've become. Whether she'd be proud or disappointed that I've spent so much of my life building a company instead of building a life. He paused. Sometimes I dream that she's still alive, and I get to introduce her to you, and she tells me I finally did something right. The vulnerability in that admission made Deborah's chest ache. She'd be proud of you. How could she not be? You've built something incredible. Have I? David asked. Or have I just built a very expensive distraction from the fact that I don't know how to be close to people? You're being close to me right now, Deborah pointed out. That seems like progress. David's laugh was soft. It's terrifying, actually, being this honest. But it's also relief. Like I've been holding my breath for 15 years, and you're the first person who's made me feel like I can exhale. They talked late into the night, sharing stories and secrets and small vulnerabilities. Deborah learned that David had wanted to be an astronaut when he was 8, that he still felt guilty about not visiting his mother's grave more often, and that he hated the taste of coffee but drank it anyway because successful people were supposed to. David learned that Deborah had almost become a teacher, that she sent anonymous money to her old high school scholarship fund, and that she cried during animated movies but never during dramas. By the time they finally went to bed, separately, Deborah in the guest room because they'd agreed to take things slow despite the accelerated timeline, they knew each other in ways that mattered more than knowing favorite colors or coffee orders. And in 4 days, they'd stand in front of everyone who mattered to David and promise to love each other forever. The terrifying part was that Deborah was starting to believe she actually could. The morning of the wedding, Deborah woke up in David's Hamptons house to find Catherine already orchestrating controlled chaos. Hairstylists, makeup artists, the photographer, the florist, all moving through the house with the precision of a military operation. Deborah sat in the master bedroom that had been converted into a bridal suite, watching a woman named Simone work magic with her natural curls, and tried to convince herself this was real. In 3 hours, she'd be married to David Ashford. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt strangely calm, like she'd been moving toward this moment her entire life without realizing it. The dress hanging on the closet door was simple but elegant, ivory silk that flowed like water, with a neckline that was modest but striking. Nothing like the elaborate gowns she'd seen in bridal magazines, but perfect for who she actually was. "You're thinking too hard," Catherine observed from the doorway. "I can see the gears turning from here." "I'm getting married today," Deborah said. "I'm allowed to think hard." "Are you having second thoughts?" Catherine asked, moving into the room and dismissing the makeup artist with a gesture. "Because if you are, now's the time to say something. David would understand." "I'm not having second thoughts," Deborah said, surprising herself with how true it was. "I'm just processing. 3 weeks ago, I was a waitress planning to open a cafe. Now I'm marrying a billionaire and my life is completely different." "Is it though?" Catherine asked perceptively. "Or are you still the same person, just in different circumstances?" "The cafe is still happening. David transferred the full $2 million yesterday, as promised. Your dreams haven't changed, Deborah. Just your resources for achieving them." Deborah met Catherine's eyes in the mirror. "You know about the contract being void?" "Of course I know," Catherine replied. "I know everything. It's my job. But more importantly, I know that what started as a business arrangement has become something real. I've watched David fall in love with you over the past few weeks, and I've watched you fight it every step of the way because you're terrified of being hurt. Is it that obvious?" Deborah asked. "To me, yes. But that's only because I've known David for 12 years and I've gotten good at reading him. Which means I've also gotten good at reading the people who matter to him." Catherine paused. "For what it's worth, I think you're exactly what he needs. You challenge him, you don't let him get away with his workaholic tendencies, and you see him as David, not as David Ashford, billionaire CEO. That's rare and valuable." "What if I mess it up?" Deborah asked quietly. "What if I'm not enough for his world? What if—" "Stop," Catherine interrupted firmly. "David's world needs to adjust to you, not the other way around. You're not marrying his world, Deborah. You're marrying him. And he's already made it clear that if his world doesn't have room for who you actually are, then his world needs to change." A knock at the door interrupted them. One of the catering staff, Deborah, recognized the nervousness of someone working their first high-end event, and appeared with a small box. "This just arrived for Ms. Smith," the young woman said. "The delivery man said it was urgent." Catherine took the box, examining it with the suspicion of someone who dealt with too many security threats. After checking it thoroughly, she handed it to Deborah. Inside was a vintage compass, brass and beautifully engraved, with a note in David's precise handwriting. "For finding your way home, no matter how far you travel. You're my true north. D. Deborah's eyes stung with tears that Simone immediately scolded her for almost ruining the makeup. But she clutched the compass like a lifeline, this tangible evidence that David understood her fear of losing herself in his world. That man is dangerously romantic, Catherine observed. I've never seen him like this with anyone else. What was he like before? Deborah asked. With other women. Catherine considered the question carefully. Polite. Appropriate. Completely detached emotionally. He'd take them to the right events, say the right things, and never let them get close enough to actually matter. I used to worry he'd spend his entire life behind walls, too afraid of being hurt or disappointed to let anyone in. She smiled. Then you came along and dismantled his walls without even trying. I tried very hard not to dismantle anything, Deborah protested. I was just trying to do my job. Exactly, Catherine said. You treated him like a regular person instead of treating him like a prize to be won. That's what made all the difference. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of final preparations. Deborah's hands shook slightly as Simone fastened the delicate earrings David had sent, family heirlooms, Catherine explained, that had belonged to his mother. The dress fit perfectly, thanks to Philip's expert tailoring. And when Deborah finally looked at herself in the full-length mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked like a bride. More than that, she looked like herself, elevated but not transformed. Still, Deborah Smith, just wearing the most beautiful dress she'd ever owned. He's going to lose his mind when he sees you, Catherine predicted. In the best possible way. The ceremony was set up on the terrace overlooking the ocean, decorated simply with white flowers and gauzy fabric that moved in the breeze. The guest list was small, fewer than 50 people, mostly David's family and a handful of close friends. Deborah had no family to invite, which should have made her sad, but instead felt oddly freeing. This was about building something new, not carrying forward old pain. Catherine walked her through the final logistics, then paused at the door. One more thing. Marcus arrived an hour ago, and he's already stirring up trouble. He's been asking pointed questions about your relationship timeline, making comments about how quickly everything happened. David shut him down, but I wanted you to be prepared. I can handle Marcus, Deborah said with more confidence than she felt. I know you can, Catherine replied. But you shouldn't have to on your wedding day. If he says anything that crosses the line, you let me know. I've been wanting an excuse to put that man in his place for years. Deborah waited in the house while the guests took their seats, watching through the window as David's family assembled. She spotted Charles immediately, sitting in the front row, looking frail but dignified. David's father, Richard, was there with Veronica, both looking uncomfortable in a way that suggested they'd rather be anywhere else. And there was Marcus, handsome and polished, standing near the back with an expression that Deborah couldn't quite read. The music started, not the traditional wedding march, but a string quartet playing something modern and beautiful that David had chosen. Catherine gave her a final encouraging smile, and then Deborah was walking across the terrace, past the assembled guests, toward David, waiting at the makeshift altar. He turned when he heard her approach, and the expression on his face made Deborah's breath catch. This was how he'd looked at her in that photograph from the press release, raw and unguarded and completely real. Like she was the only person in the world who mattered. Deborah reached him and took his outstretched hands, and for a moment, they just stood there, looking at each other while the officiant waited patiently. Hi, David whispered. Hi, Deborah whispered back. You're beautiful, he said. Absolutely stunning. You're not so bad yourself, Deborah replied, taking in his perfectly tailored suit and the way his eyes had gone slightly wet. The officiant cleared his throat gently, and they both turned their attention to him, though David kept hold of Deborah's hands like he was afraid she might disappear. The ceremony began with traditional words about love and commitment, about two people choosing to build a life together. But when it came time for the vows, David and Deborah had prepared their own words. David went first, his voice steady despite the emotion Deborah could see in his eyes. Deborah, 3 weeks ago, you were serving me dinner and probably wishing I'd leave a better tip. Today, you're standing here about to become my wife, and I still can't quite believe you said yes. A ripple of laughter moved through the guests. I know our timeline seems fast. I know people are probably wondering if this is real or if we've lost our minds. But here's what I know for certain. You make me want to be better. Not more successful or wealthier, just more present, more honest, more willing to actually live instead of just exist. You see through all my defenses, and instead of running away, you stayed. You chose me, even though I come with complications and family drama and workaholic tendencies, I'm still trying to manage." He paused, and Deborah saw him blink back tears. "I promise to never let you feel invisible. I promise to support your dreams as fiercely as you support mine. I promise to argue with you when you're wrong and admit it when I'm wrong, even though that's really hard for me." More laughter. "I promise to love you not despite your walls and your fears and your carefully constructed defenses, but because of them, because they're part of what makes you who you are. And I promise that every single day, I will choose you again, the way I'm choosing you today." Deborah's vision blurred with tears that she absolutely was not supposed to cry because it would ruin Simone's carefully applied makeup. But she couldn't help it, because David had just stood in front of everyone he knew and promised her exactly what she needed to hear. Then it was her turn, and Deborah took a steadying breath. "David, when you first asked me to pretend to be your wife, I thought you were crazy." The guests laughed, and even Charles cracked a smile. $2 million to play a role for 6 weeks? It seemed too good to be true, which meant it probably was. But what I didn't anticipate was that pretending would become real so quickly that I'd forget we were acting. You made me brave enough to want more than the safe, small life I'd built. You saw me, really saw me, when I'd spent 7 years perfecting the art of being invisible. She squeezed his hands, drawing strength from his presence. "I promise to never let you hide behind work when things get hard. I promise to call you on your bullshit, because you need someone who will. I promise to remember that underneath the billionaire CEO is just a man who wants to be loved for who he is, not what he has. I promise to be your true north, the way you've become mine." She touched the compass he'd given her, now tucked in her bouquet. "And I promise that I will never stop choosing you, even when it's scary, even when I want to run and hide behind my walls. Because you're worth being brave for." The officiant declared them married, and David pulled Deborah into a kiss that was both tender and claiming, like he was announcing to the world that she was his and he was hers. The guests applauded, and Deborah heard Charles' voice above the others, "About damn time." The reception was held in David's house, transformed by Catherine's organizational magic into something elegant but warm. Deborah moved through the party in a daze, accepting congratulations from people she'd only met through photographs, trying to remember names and relationships while David's hand stayed firmly in hers. Charles pulled her aside during cocktail hour, his expression serious. "That was a good ceremony," he said. "Real vows, not the standard script. I appreciate that." "We wanted to be honest," Deborah replied. "And are you?" Charles asked, his sharp eyes boring into hers. "Honest about your feelings for my grandson?" Deborah could have deflected, could have given him the polished answer she'd practiced. Instead, she chose truth. "When this started, I was doing it for the money," she admitted. "I won't insult you by pretending otherwise. But somewhere between the contract and today, it became real. I fell in love with your grandson despite my best efforts not to, and now I'm terrified because I have no idea how to be married to someone I actually care about." Charles studied her for a long moment, then smiled, a genuine expression that softened his weathered face. "Good. Fear means you understand the stakes. People who aren't afraid of love usually don't value it properly." He paused. "David's mother would have liked you. She was never comfortable with wealth either, always more interested in substance than status. Take care of him, Deborah. He pretends he doesn't need taking care of, but that's just pride talking." "I will," Deborah promised. "And let him take care of you too," Charles added. "That's what partnership means. Both people being strong enough to also be vulnerable." Before Deborah could respond, Marcus appeared at her elbow, champagne in hand and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sister-in-law," he said, the term sounding slightly mocking. "Congratulations on landing the catch of the century." "Marcus," Deborah replied carefully. "Thank you for coming." "I wouldn't miss it," Marcus said. "Though I have to admit, I'm curious about the timeline. 3 months of dating and you're already married? That's impressively fast. Almost like there was some external pressure driving the schedule." Charles's eyes narrowed. "Marcus, this is neither the time nor the place." "I'm just making conversation, grandfather," Marcus interrupted smoothly. Surely Deborah doesn't mind answering a simple question about how she and David fell in love so quickly. Deborah felt the trap in the question, saw the calculation behind Marcus's pleasant expression. He was testing her, looking for inconsistencies or signs that their relationship was performative. But she'd been preparing for this moment since the day she'd agreed to David's arrangement. "When you meet the right person, you know," Deborah said simply. "David and I spent 3 months getting to know each other, discovering that we understood each other in ways neither of us had experienced before. When he proposed, it wasn't about rushing into anything. It was about being honest that we'd both found what we'd been looking for." "How romantic," Marcus said, his tone suggesting he thought it was anything but. "And the fact that grandfathers will requires David to be married to maintain controlling interest in Ashford Industries, that's just a happy coincidence." The room had gone quiet around them. Deborah felt multiple pairs of eyes watching this exchange, waiting to see how she'd respond. David was moving toward them, his expression dark, but Charles held up a hand to stop him. "Let her handle it," Charles murmured to David. "She needs to learn to navigate this family without you running interference." Deborah met Marcus's gaze steadily. "I'm aware of the will stipulations. David told me about them on our second date, actually, because he believes in honesty even when it's complicated. But here's what you need to understand, Marcus, I didn't marry David for his money or his company or because of inheritance requirements. I married him because he's kind and brilliant and makes me want to be braver than I've ever been. The fact that our marriage also satisfies your grandfather's requirements is convenient. Yes. But it's not why I said yes." "Convenient," Marcus repeated, latching onto the word. "Interesting choice. Almost like this whole thing was planned." "That's enough," David said, finally reaching them and inserting himself between Deborah and Marcus. "You've made your point, Marcus. You think this is some kind of scheme. But you know what? I don't care what you think. I married the woman I love, and whether you believe that or not is completely irrelevant to me." "Is it though?" Marcus challenged. "Because your wife's credibility affects the company's stability. If the board thinks this marriage is a sham designed to manipulate grandfather's will, they'll challenge it. And then everything falls apart anyway." "The board isn't going to challenge anything," Charles interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded empires. "Because I'm going to make it very clear that I approve of this marriage and that anyone who questions it will answer to me. Are we understood, Marcus?" Marcus's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Clear, grandfather." "Good," Charles said. "Now go find something productive to do instead of harassing your brother's new wife on her wedding day." Marcus left, but not before shooting Deborah a look that promised this wasn't over. She watched him go, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline of confrontation. "I'm sorry," David said immediately, pulling her close. He had no right. "I handled it," Deborah interrupted. "And I'll handle it again if I need to. Marcus doesn't scare me." "He should," David said grimly. "He's dangerous when he feels threatened, and our marriage threatens everything he's been working toward for years." "Then we'll deal with it together," Deborah said firmly. "That's what marriage means, right? Facing problems as a team." David's expression softened. "When did you get so wise?" "About 3 weeks ago, when a billionaire made me an offer I couldn't refuse," Deborah replied, and was rewarded with David's genuine laugh. The rest of the reception passed without incident. They cut the cake, an elaborate construction that Catherine had commissioned from some famous bakery. They had their first dance to a song Deborah had mentioned loving in one of their late-night conversations, and David had remembered. They posed for pictures that would probably end up in magazines and tabloids, but Deborah found she cared less about that than she'd expected. As the sun set and the party wound down, David pulled Deborah onto the terrace where they'd had that first dinner together, back when everything was still pretend. "So," he said, wrapping his arms around her waist. "How does it feel to be Mrs. Ashford?" "Terrifying," Deborah admitted. "But also right, somehow. Like this is where I was supposed to end up, even though the path here was completely insane." "We can still go back to calling you Deborah Smith if you prefer," David offered. "I don't need you to take my name to prove anything." "I know," Deborah said. "But I think I like being Deborah Ashford. It sounds like someone brave enough to build the life she actually wants instead of settling for what feels safe." David kissed her forehead. "That person was always there. I just permitted you to acknowledge her." They stood on the terrace as the last guests departed, as Catherine oversaw the cleanup with her usual efficiency, as David's family dispersed back to their various lives. And for the first time since this whole arrangement began, Deborah felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 7 years. She felt like she was home. The honeymoon wasn't a honeymoon in the traditional sense. David couldn't take weeks away from Ashford Industries, and Deborah wasn't ready for the media circus that would follow them to some tropical paradise. Instead, they spent a week at the Hamptons' house, learning how to be married to each other without the pressure of external expectations. It was surprisingly difficult. Deborah woke up the morning after the wedding in David's bed, their bed now, she supposed, and experienced a moment of pure panic. She was married to a billionaire. Her life had fundamentally changed in ways she was only beginning to process, and there was no going back to the safety of her studio apartment and her carefully controlled existence. David was already awake, working on his laptop despite it being barely 6 in the morning. He looked up when he felt her stir, and his smile was soft and genuine. "Morning, wife," he said, testing out the word. "Morning, husband," Deborah replied, and the word felt strange in her mouth, foreign but not unwelcome. "I made coffee," David said, gesturing to the mug on her nightstand. "Though I should warn you it's probably terrible. Catherine usually handles the coffee situation, and I'm completely incompetent without her." Deborah took a sip and tried not to wince. It was, in fact, terrible, weak and somehow simultaneously bitter. But the fact that David had tried, that he'd thought about what she might want when she woke up, made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. "It's perfect," she lied. "You're a terrible liar," David said affectionately. "But I appreciate the effort. Next time I'll just wait for Catherine to arrive." They fell into a rhythm over the next few days that felt almost normal. David worked in his office, and Deborah started planning the cafe in earnest, now that she actually had the capital to make it happen. She spent hours researching locations, reaching out to commercial real estate agents, sketching floor plans and menu ideas in the notebook she'd carried for years. But some moments reminded her their situation was anything but normal. The security detail that now followed her everywhere. The constant media attention. Paparazzi camped outside the estate gates, hoping for photos of the new Mrs. Ashford. The messages flooding her phone from people she hadn't spoken to in years were suddenly interested in reconnecting now that she was married to money. On the third day, Deborah's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, assuming it was another reporter or distant acquaintance looking to cash in on her new status. But something made her pick up. "Ms. Smith," a woman's voice said. "Or I suppose it's Mrs. Ashford now. This is Jennifer Blackwood from the New York Times. I'm working on a feature about your relationship with David Ashford, and I was hoping you'd be willing to talk." "I'm not giving interviews," Deborah said automatically. "I understand," Jennifer replied smoothly. "But I wanted to give you the opportunity to tell your side of the story before we go to press. We've received some concerning information from a source close to the Ashford family suggesting that your marriage might not be entirely genuine." Deborah's blood went cold. "What source?" "I can't reveal that," Jennifer said. "But they've provided documentation suggesting that you and David entered into a financial arrangement before your engagement. Specifically, a contract outlining payment in exchange for a 6-week marriage." Marcus. It had to be Marcus. Somehow, he'd gotten access to information about their original arrangement. "No comment," Deborah said and hung up. Her hands were shaking as she found David in his office. He took one look at her face and immediately closed his laptop. "What happened?" Deborah told him about the call, watching his expression darken with each word. By the time she finished, David was already dialing his phone. "Catherine, I need you to get our crisis management team on a call immediately. Marcus leaked information about the original contract to the New York Times, and they're threatening to run a story." He paused, listening. "I don't care if it's Sunday. Get everyone on the line in 20 minutes. The next hour was chaos. David's publicist, his lawyers, and Catherine all conferenced in, debating strategies for managing the crisis. The consensus was that denial wouldn't work. If Marcus had actual documentation, denial would only make them look worse when the truth came out. "We need to get ahead of this," Jennifer, David's publicist, not the reporter, said. "Control the narrative before the Times does it for us." "How?" David asked, his voice tight with frustration. "You tell the truth," Jennifer suggested. "Yes, you initially entered into an arrangement. But feelings developed, and what started as a business deal became real. It's actually a compelling love story if we frame it right. Two people who thought they were just playing roles until they realized they'd fallen for each other." "That's not framing," Deborah said quietly. "That's just what happened." Then we use that, Jennifer said. Deborah, you'd need to do a sit-down interview. Something intimate and honest, where you can explain in your own words how your relationship evolved. We can probably get Oprah. No, Deborah interrupted. Not Oprah. Not some big primetime special. If I'm going to do this, I want it to be real, not produced. What about that podcast David mentioned, the one that does long-form interviews with interesting people? The Honest Hour. Catherine said. That could actually work. The host, Rebecca Sterling, is known for tough but fair questions. If you can win her over, you'll win over her audience. Set it up, David said. But Deborah, you don't have to do this. We can fight the Times, threaten legal action. No, Deborah said firmly. Marcus is counting on us running and hiding. He wants us to look guilty. So instead, we're going to tell the truth and let people decide for themselves whether to believe us. The interview was scheduled for 3 days later, giving Deborah barely any time to prepare. Catherine brought in a media coach again, Diane, who trained her for the press conference, but this time, Deborah pushed back against the rehearsed answers. I need to just be honest, she told Diane. If I sound coached, people won't believe me. And the whole point is to be believable. Honesty is risky, Diane warned. Rebecca Sterling will ask hard questions. She'll push you on the money, on the timeline, on whether your feelings are real or just convenient. Then I'll answer honestly, Deborah said. Because my feelings are real, and I'm tired of being afraid that admitting the truth makes me look bad. The night before the interview, Deborah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed next to David, listening to him breathe, thinking about everything she'd have to say tomorrow. Not just about the contract and the arrangement, but about her own fears and vulnerabilities, her history of protecting herself by staying invisible. I can hear you thinking, David murmured in the darkness. Talk to me. I'm scared, Deborah admitted. Not of the interview itself. I'm scared that when I tell the truth about how we started, people will think I'm a gold digger who's just playing a long game. I'm scared they'll think you're naive for believing that I actually love you. David rolled over to face her, his hand finding hers in the dark. Do you love me? Yes, Deborah said without hesitation. I really do. I didn't want to, and I tried not to, but I do. Then that's all that matters, David said. Let people think what they want. We know the truth. Your company, Deborah started. Will survive, David interrupted. Even if the board loses confidence, even if there's a leadership challenge, Ashford Industries will survive. But I won't survive losing you because we were too afraid to be honest about how we started. The interview took place in David's Manhattan penthouse, Rebecca Sterling arriving with a small crew and an expression that suggested she wasn't going to pull any punches. She was in her 40s, impeccably dressed, with intelligent eyes that seemed to catalogue everything. Thank you for agreeing to this, Rebecca said as her crew set up. I know it can't be easy, given the circumstances. It's necessary, Deborah replied. There's a story circulating that makes our relationship look like a fraud, and I want people to understand the actual truth. Which is? Rebecca prompted. Complicated, Deborah admitted. But real. The interview started with softball questions: how they met, what their first impressions were of each other, what made them decide to pursue a relationship. Deborah answered honestly, sticking to the timeline they'd established but adding emotional details that made it feel more genuine. Then Rebecca got to the hard part. There are reports that you and David entered into a financial arrangement before your engagement, Rebecca said. Specifically, that David offered to pay you $2 million to pretend to be his wife for 6 weeks to satisfy an inheritance requirement. Is that true? Deborah took a deep breath. This was it, the moment where she either lied to protect herself or told the truth and dealt with the consequences. Yes, she said clearly. That's true. David approached me with that offer about a month ago. Rebecca's eyebrows rose slightly. Clearly she'd expected denial. So your relationship started as a business transaction. It did, Deborah confirmed. David needed to be married to satisfy his grandfather's will, and I needed money to open a cafe I'd been planning for years. So we agreed to a temporary arrangement, 6 weeks of pretending to be married, and then we'd go our separate ways. But you actually got married, Rebecca pointed out. That seems like more than a 6-week arrangement. Because it became more, Deborah said. Somewhere between the contract and the wedding, We stopped pretending. We got to know each other, and we realized that what we felt was real, not performative. So David voided the contract, gave me the money anyway with no strings attached, and asked if I wanted to try dating for real. And you said yes, Rebecca said. Even though you'd already gotten the money. I said yes because I'd fallen in love with him, Deborah replied. The money gave me financial security, which meant I could make a choice based on what I actually wanted instead of what I needed. And what I wanted was David. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, studying Deborah's face. That's either the most romantic thing I've ever heard or the most elaborate con in recent history. How do we know which one it is? You don't, Deborah admitted. You have to decide whether to believe me or not. But I'll tell you this, I spent 7 years working as a waitress, being invisible, protecting myself from being hurt by never letting anyone get close enough to hurt me. David made me want to be visible again, even though it was terrifying. He saw me, really saw me, and he made me brave enough to want more than the safe, small life I'd built. That's not something you can fake. What about the criticism that you're a gold digger? Rebecca asked bluntly. That you saw an opportunity and took it. I did see an opportunity, Deborah said. When David first made his offer, I absolutely saw it as a business opportunity, a chance to get the capital I needed to achieve my dreams. I'm not going to apologize for that. Poor people don't get to be noble about money. We have to be practical. But what happened after I took that opportunity? Falling in love, choosing to stay even after I got the money, that wasn't calculated. That was just honest. Rebecca leaned forward. Some people will say that $2 million is a pretty good incentive to claim you're in love. Those people have never been in love, Deborah replied. Because if they had, they'd know that no amount of money is worth the vulnerability of actually opening yourself up to another person. Being in love is terrifying. It means giving someone the power to hurt you, to disappoint you, to leave you. I could have taken the money and walked away. That was the original plan. But I stayed because David is worth being terrified for. The interview continued for another hour, Rebecca asking increasingly personal questions about their relationship, their plans for the future, how they navigated the wealth disparity between them. Deborah answered all of it honestly, sometimes uncomfortably so, laying bare her fears and insecurities in a way that felt like emotional surgery. When it was finally over, Rebecca turned off her recorder and studied Deborah with an expression that was hard to read. I've interviewed hundreds of people, Rebecca said finally. Politicians, celebrities, CEOs. I've gotten very good at spotting when someone's lying to me. And I don't think you're lying, Deborah. I think you're exactly what you appear to be, a woman who took a risk, fell in love, and is now terrified that the world won't believe you. Will they? Deborah asked. Believe me. Some will, Rebecca replied. Others won't, no matter what you say. But I'll tell you what I believe. I believe that love doesn't follow a timeline or a script. I believe that sometimes the most real relationships start in the most unlikely ways. And I believe that you and David are the real thing, even if how you started was unconventional. The episode aired 2 days later, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with opinions, some people praising Deborah's honesty, others convinced she was running a long con. Think pieces appeared in every major publication, debating whether their relationship validated or undermined traditional ideas about love and marriage. But the response that mattered most came from Charles, who called the day after the episode aired. That was well done, he said when David put him on speaker. Honest, vulnerable, and smart. You didn't try to pretend you were perfect. You just admitted you were human. That takes courage. Thank you, Deborah said, her voice rough with emotion. The board met this morning, Charles continued. There were some concerns about the optics of your arrangement, but I made it clear that I fully support this marriage and that anyone who challenges it will answer to me. David retains controlling interest, and Marcus can go pound sand. After they hung up, David pulled Deborah into his arms, and she finally let herself cry, not from sadness, but from the relief of having survived the scrutiny and come out the other side with her relationship intact. We did it, she whispered against his chest. We actually pulled this off. We didn't pull anything off, David corrected gently. We just told the truth and trusted that it would be enough. That night, they had dinner on the terrace. Just the two of them, no staff, no security hovering nearby. David had ordered takeout from a small Thai place in Brooklyn that Deborah had mentioned loving, and they ate straight from the containers, talking and laughing like normal people instead of a billionaire and his supposedly scandalous wife. "I've been thinking," David said as they finished their meal, "about the cafe. I want to help, not just financially, but actually help. I could handle the business side, set up your LLC, negotiate leases, manage the finances. That way you can focus on the creative parts, the menu, the design, the experience you want to create." Deborah's first instinct was to refuse, to insist she could do it herself. But she was learning to accept help, learning that accepting support wasn't the same as giving up independence. "I'd like that," she said. "As long as you remember it's my cafe, not ours. I need to build something that's mine." "Understood," David said. "I'm support staff only. You're the boss." "I'm always the boss," Deborah teased. "Yes, dear," David replied with mock solemnity, and Deborah threw a napkin at him. Later, as they lay in bed, Deborah thought about how far she'd come in just a month. From invisible waitress to billionaire's wife, from carefully controlled isolation to terrifying vulnerability, from survival to actually living. It wasn't the path she'd planned, and it certainly wasn't safe. But it was hers, and for the first time in her life, that felt like enough. "David," she said into the darkness. "Yeah." "Thank you for asking me to pretend. Even though we're not pretending anymore." David's arms tightened around her. "Best business decision I ever made." "I thought this wasn't business anymore," Deborah said. "It's not," David agreed. "But if it were, you'd definitely be my most profitable investment." Deborah elbowed him gently. "You're terrible at romance." "And yet you married me anyway," David pointed out. "Which means either you have terrible judgment, or I'm better at romance than I think." "Definitely terrible judgment," Deborah said, but she was smiling in the dark. Outside, the ocean whispered against the shore, and Manhattan glittered in the distance, and Deborah felt something she'd spent 29 years thinking she didn't deserve. She felt happy. 6 months after the wedding, Deborah stood in front of a brick building in Brooklyn and tried to convince herself this was really happening. The cafe, her cafe, was 3 days from opening, and she was equal parts terrified and exhilarated. The space had taken 4 months to find and another 2 to renovate. David had been true to his word, handling the business logistics while staying out of the creative decisions. The result was exactly what Deborah had envisioned during those 7 years of saving pennies: exposed brick walls, mismatched vintage furniture that felt welcoming rather than pretentious, large windows that let in natural light, and a menu board where she'd handwritten offerings that ranged from classic coffee drinks to pastries she'd spent weeks perfecting. She'd named it North Star Cafe, a nod to the compass David had given her on their wedding day. The one that reminded her she could find her way home, no matter how far she traveled. "Stop second-guessing yourself," Catherine said, appearing beside her with her ever-present tablet. "The space is beautiful, the menu is solid, and you've hired good people. You're ready." Deborah had hired a small staff, 3 baristas and 2 bakers, all people she'd known from her years in the service industry who needed a chance the way she once had. She was paying them well above minimum wage, offering health insurance, and creating the kind of workplace she wished she'd had at the Sterling Club. "What if no one comes?" Deborah asked, voicing the fear that had kept her up at night. "What if this whole thing is a disaster?" "Then you adjust and try again," Catherine said pragmatically. "But honestly, Deborah, you're probably going to have the opposite problem. You're married to David Ashford. When word gets out that this is your place, you're going to be flooded with people wanting to say they got coffee from the billionaire's wife." "I don't want people to come because of David," Deborah protested. "I want them to come because the coffee is good and the space is welcoming." "They'll come for David and stay for the coffee," Catherine predicted. "That's how it works. Use the advantage you have, then prove you deserve the success on your own merits." David arrived an hour later, fresh from a board meeting, still in his suit but with his tie loosened in the way that meant he'd been frustrated. He pulled Deborah into his arms immediately, and she felt some of her anxiety ease. "How's it looking?" he asked, surveying the space. "Terrifying," Deborah admitted. "I'm opening a cafe in one of the most competitive markets in the world, and I have no idea what I'm doing." "You know exactly what you're doing," David corrected. "You've been planning this for 7 years. You know what works and what doesn't because you've watched other establishments succeed and fail. You've got this." "How was the board meeting?" Deborah asked, noticing the tension in his shoulders. "Marcus is still making noise about challenging my leadership," David said. He's convinced that the publicity around our relationship has damaged the company's reputation. Never mind that our stock price has actually gone up since the wedding. Marcus had been a constant thorn in their side over the past 6 months. He'd leaked the original contract to the media, given anonymous interviews suggesting their marriage was a fraud, and done everything in his power to undermine David's position at Ashford Industries. But each attack had somehow backfired. The honesty of Deborah's podcast interview had won over more people than it had alienated, and the love story of the billionaire and the waitress had captured public imagination in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. "He's not going to stop," Deborah observed. "No," David agreed. "But he's also not going to win. Charles made his position clear, and the board respects his opinion. Marcus is just making noise at this point." "Still," Deborah said, "it must be exhausting, constantly defending your own brother." "He stopped being my brother a long time ago," David said, his voice tight with old pain. "Now he's just a competitor I'm related to." The cafe's soft opening was scheduled for the following day, just friends and family, a chance to work out any kinks before the official grand opening. Deborah spent the night before unable to sleep, running through mental checklists, worrying about everything that could go wrong. David finally pulled her out of bed at 2 in the morning and guided her to the kitchen. "We're making cookies," he announced. "Why?" Deborah asked, confused. "Because you need to stop thinking about the cafe, and the only way to do that is to give your brain something else to focus on. So we're making cookies. Badly, probably, but that's beside the point." They spent the next hour making chocolate chip cookies from scratch, making a mess of David's pristine kitchen, laughing when the first batch came out slightly burned. By the time they were done, Deborah's anxiety had receded to manageable levels, replaced by the simple pleasure of doing something ordinary with someone she loved. "Thank you," she said, stealing a warm cookie from the cooling rack. "For what?" David asked, stealing one for himself. "For knowing what I needed before I did. For being patient with my anxiety. For believing in me even when I don't believe in myself." "That's what marriage is," David said simply. "Being the person who believes in your partner's dreams even when they're too scared to." The soft opening the next day was everything Deborah had hoped for. Charles arrived first, surveying the space with his sharp eyes before declaring it acceptable, which from Charles was high praise. David's father Richard came with Veronica, both looking uncomfortable but making an effort. Catherine was there, of course, along with several of David's close friends from Ashford Industries. But the person whose opinion Deborah valued most was Rebecca Sterling, the podcast host who'd given her a platform to tell her truth. Rebecca had become an unlikely friend over the past 6 months, checking in periodically to see how Deborah was adjusting to life as David Ashford's wife. "This place is perfect," Rebecca said, accepting a latte that Deborah had made herself. "It feels like you, warm, authentic, unpretentious." "That's exactly what I was going for," Deborah said, relieved. "The pastries are incredible too," Rebecca continued, sampling a croissant. "You could have just coasted on being David's wife, opened some vanity project that was more about status than substance. But this is the real thing. You should be proud." Deborah was about to respond when she saw Marcus enter the cafe, and her entire body tensed. David noticed immediately, moving to her side with protective instinct. "I didn't invite him," David said quietly. "I know," Deborah replied. "But he's here, so we might as well deal with it." Marcus approached the counter where Deborah stood, his expression carefully neutral. Up close, she could see the resemblance to David, the same sharp features, the same dark eyes. But where David's eyes held warmth, Marcus's held calculation. "Congratulations on the cafe," Marcus said, his tone making the words sound almost mocking. "Though I have to wonder, would any of this have happened if you hadn't married my brother?" "Probably not," Deborah admitted, refusing to be baited. "The money David gave me made this possible. But that doesn't make it any less real or any less mine." "Interesting choice of words," Marcus said. "The money David gave me. Not the money I earned or the money we invested together. Just money he gave you. Sounds a lot like a payoff, doesn't it?" "Marcus," David warned, his voice low and dangerous. "That's enough." "Is it?" Marcus challenged. "Because I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking. That Deborah saw an opportunity and took it. That she's playing you, David, and you're too blinded by whatever you think you feel to see it." "What I think I feel," David repeated, his voice getting colder. I know exactly what I feel, Marcus. I love my wife. And the fact that you can't understand that you can't conceive of a relationship based on something other than transaction and manipulation, says a lot more about you than it does about us. I'm trying to protect you, Marcus insisted. Someone has to, since you clearly can't protect yourself. She's using you, David. Using your money, your name, your resources. And when she's gotten everything she can from you, she'll leave. Deborah had been trying to stay calm, to not let Marcus's words get under her skin. But something in his casual certainty that she was incapable of genuine feeling made her anger override her caution. You want to know why I married David? Deborah said, her voice sharp enough to cut. Yes, it started with money. Yes, I took an opportunity that most people would have taken in my position. But I stayed. I chose to actually marry him, to build a life with him, because he's the first person who ever made me feel like I deserved to be seen. He's kind and brilliant and sometimes infuriatingly stubborn, but he's real. He's honest. And he makes me want to be braver than I ever thought I could be. She stepped out from behind the counter, moving closer to Marcus. You, on the other hand, are so convinced that everyone operates from the same place of calculated self-interest that you can't even conceive of the possibility that two people might actually love each other. And that's sad, Marcus. Not threatening or impressive, just sad. Because it means you've never felt anything real enough to understand what David and I have. The cafe had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching the confrontation, waiting to see how Marcus would respond. For a moment, his carefully controlled expression cracked, and Deborah saw something that looked almost like pain in his eyes. You don't know anything about me, Marcus said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. I know you're lonely, Deborah said, more gently now. I know you've spent your whole life competing with David, trying to prove you're just as good, just as worthy. And I know that's exhausting. But Marcus, the problem isn't that David has things you don't. The problem is that you're so focused on what he has that you can't build anything of your own. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, and Deborah wondered if she'd gotten through to him, if there was any possibility of reaching the hurt younger brother beneath the hostile competitor. Then his expression hardened again. This isn't over, he said quietly. You might have everyone else fooled, but I see exactly what you are. He left without another word, and the cafe slowly returned to normal conversation levels. But Deborah was shaking, the adrenaline of confrontation making her hands tremble. David pulled her into his arms. I'm sorry. I should have anticipated he'd show up, should have had security. It's okay, Deborah interrupted. He needed to hear that. Maybe it won't change anything, but at least I said it. Charles approached them, leaning on his cane but with approval in his eyes. That was well handled. Marcus has needed someone to call him on his bullshit for years, but he doesn't listen to me anymore. Maybe he'll listen to you. I doubt it, Deborah said. Probably not, Charles agreed. But you planted a seed. Sometimes that's all you can do. The rest of the soft opening went smoothly, and by the time the last guest left, Deborah was exhausted but satisfied. The cafe worked. The space felt right. And despite Marcus's attempts to poison the experience, she'd proven, to herself more than anyone, that she belonged here, that she'd earned this. The official grand opening 2 days later was chaos. The line stretched around the block, some people genuinely interested in good coffee, others clearly there to see the famous Mrs. Ashford in her natural habitat. Deborah worked alongside her staff, making drinks and serving pastries, falling back into the rhythm of service work but with the crucial difference that this time, she was the owner, not the employee. David stayed mostly out of the way, working from a corner table but available if she needed him. And it was good to know he was there, a quiet support, but not trying to take over or manage her success. Rebecca Sterling came by mid-morning and filmed a short segment for her podcast, talking to customers about why they'd come and what they thought of the cafe. The responses were overwhelmingly positive. People loved the space, loved the coffee, and seemed genuinely happy for Deborah's success rather than resentful of it. This is going to be a hit, Rebecca predicted. You've created something special here. By the time they closed that first day, Deborah was exhausted but happy in a way she couldn't remember being before. Her feet hurt, her back ached, and she smelled like coffee and butter, but she'd done it. She'd built something real, something hers, something that would exist whether or not she was married to David Ashford. That night, she and David sat on the terrace of the Hamptons house. They'd been splitting their time between there and the Manhattan penthouse, but Deborah still thought of the Hamptons as home. The ocean whispered in the darkness, and Deborah leaned against David's shoulder, feeling peaceful in a way that still sometimes surprised her. "Do you ever regret it?" David asked suddenly. "Saying yes to my ridiculous proposal? Your life would be a lot simpler if you just told me no." Deborah considered the question seriously. "Simpler, maybe. But not better. I'd still be working at the Sterling Club, saving pennies, dreaming about a cafe I'd probably never have the capital to open. I'd be safe and invisible and slowly dying of loneliness without even realizing it." "And now?" David prompted. "Now I'm visible and terrified and occasionally overwhelmed, but I'm alive," Deborah said. "Really alive. Not just going through the motions. You did that. You made me brave enough to want more than survival." "We did that for each other," David corrected. "You think you're the only one who changed? Before you, I was just existing, working 18-hour days, measuring my worth by quarterly earnings, convinced that building a bigger empire would somehow fill the emptiness. But you showed me that success without connection is just expensive loneliness." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and Deborah thought about how far they'd both come. From a desperate billionaire and a cautious waitress to partners who'd built something real out of what should have been temporary. "I got something for you," David said, pulling a small box from his pocket. "I was going to wait for our 6-month anniversary, but that seems arbitrary. We've never been good at following traditional timelines anyway." Inside the box was a delicate necklace, a small compass pendant, identical to the one he'd given her on their wedding day but sized to be worn every day. "So you always know your way home," David said softly. "No matter where the cafe takes you, no matter how busy life gets, you can always find your way back to this. To us." Deborah's eyes stung with tears. "It's perfect." David fastened it around her neck, and Deborah touched the small compass, feeling the weight of it settle against her skin like a promise. "I have something for you too," Deborah said. "Though it's not as elegant as jewelry." She pulled out her phone and showed him the lease she'd been negotiating for a second location of North Star Cafe, this one in Manhattan, closer to Ashford Industries headquarters. "I thought you might like having good coffee within walking distance of your office," Deborah explained. "Plus, it means I'll be around more when you're working late. Someone needs to make sure you actually eat lunch." David's laugh was delighted. "You're expanding already. Is that okay?" Deborah asked, suddenly uncertain. "I probably should have discussed it with you first." "It's your cafe," David interrupted. "You don't need my permission. But I love that you're thinking big, that you're not content to just maintain but want to grow. That's..." He paused, searching for words. "That's exactly who I hoped you'd become once you weren't afraid anymore." "I'm still afraid," Deborah admitted. "But I'm learning that fear doesn't have to stop me. It can just be something I feel while I do the scary thing anyway." "That's all courage is," David said. "Doing it anyway." 3 months later, Deborah stood in the new Manhattan location of North Star Cafe, watching the morning rush with satisfaction. Both locations were thriving, and she'd hired enough staff that she could actually split her time between them without burning out. She was even considering a third location, though she wanted to make sure she maintained quality over quantity. The bell over the door chimed, and Deborah looked up to see Marcus enter. He'd stayed away from the Brooklyn location after their confrontation, but apparently, he'd heard about the Manhattan cafe. "Marcus," Deborah said carefully, "what can I get you?" "Just coffee," Marcus replied. "Black, no sugar." Deborah made the drink herself, noting that Marcus looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. She handed him the cup, and he took a sip before meeting her eyes. "It's good," he admitted. "The coffee. It's really good." "Thank you," Deborah said. Marcus was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, less hostile, more uncertain. "What you said at the Brooklyn opening. About me being lonely. You were right." Deborah waited, giving him space to continue. "I've spent my entire life trying to be as good as David," Marcus said. "Competing with him, trying to prove I'm just as smart, just as capable. But the truth is, I'm not. He's always been better at building things, at seeing possibilities I can't see. And instead of figuring out what I'm actually good at, I've just been trying to tear down what is built." "That must be exhausting," Deborah said quietly. "It is," Marcus admitted. "And lonely." Because when you spend your whole life competing, you don't have room for actual connections. You just have rivals and obstacles. So stop competing, Deborah suggested. Find something that's yours, something you're passionate about that has nothing to do with being better than David. Like what? Marcus asked, and he sounded genuinely lost. I don't know, Deborah said. But maybe that's the point. Maybe you need to figure out who Marcus Ashford actually is instead of who Marcus Ashford is in relation to David. Marcus stared into his coffee cup. I don't know if I know how to do that. Then learn, Deborah said. Start small. Try things. Fail at some of them. Figure out what makes you happy instead of what makes you competitive. Is it too late? Marcus asked. To fix things with David? To have an actual relationship instead of just rivalry? I don't know, Deborah said honestly. That's something you'd have to ask him. But Marcus, you have to actually want to change. Not because you think it will give you some advantage, but because you're tired of being lonely. Marcus finished his coffee and set the cup down carefully. I'll think about what you said. He left without buying anything else, but something in the conversation felt different. Like maybe, possibly, there was a chance for things to change. When Deborah told David about it that night, he was skeptical. Marcus doesn't change, David said. He just finds new angles to work. Maybe, Deborah agreed. But people can surprise you. You surprised me. I surprised myself. Maybe Marcus deserves the chance to surprise both of us. You're too forgiving, David said. I'm exactly forgiving enough, Deborah countered. Besides, wouldn't it be nice if your family could actually get along? If Thanksgiving wasn't a competition and Christmas wasn't a corporate strategy session? David pulled her close. When did you get so wise about families? You don't even have one. I have one now, Deborah pointed out. For better or worse, I married into the Ashfords. Which means I'm invested in making this family less dysfunctional, if only for my own sanity. Over the following months, something unexpected happened. Marcus started coming to the Manhattan Cafe regularly, always ordering the same black coffee, sometimes staying to work on his laptop. He and Deborah developed a cautious rapport, not quite friendship, but not hostility either. More like two people learning to exist in the same space without weapons drawn. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Marcus and David began to rebuild something that resembled a relationship. It started with Marcus asking for advice on a project he was working on, something outside of Ashford Industries, a startup he was considering investing in. David helped him think through the business model, and they ended up having their first conversation in years that didn't devolve into competition or criticism. It wasn't perfect. There were still tensions, still moments when old patterns resurfaced. But it was progress, and for Deborah, that was enough. Charles's health declined over the year, and he passed away peacefully in his sleep 13 months after David and Deborah's wedding. The funeral was massive, everyone who was anyone in New York business circles attended, but the moment that mattered most was when David stood to give the eulogy. My grandfather taught me that success means building something that outlasts you, David said, his voice steady despite the emotion Deborah knew he was feeling. But what he showed me through his actions was that legacy isn't about companies or empires. It's about the people whose lives you touch, the relationships you build, the love you give and receive. He wanted me to get married not because of some will requirement, but because he knew that connection is what makes life meaningful. He paused, looking directly at Deborah in the front row. I'm grateful that he pushed me toward that understanding. Because his insistence that I settle down led me to the love of my life. And while I wish he'd had more time to see what Deborah and I are building together, I know he died happy because he saw that I'd finally figured out what really matters. At the reception after the funeral, Marcus approached Deborah and David together. I'm sorry for everything, he said, speaking to both of them but looking at David. The leaks to the press, the attempts to undermine you, the hostility. I was jealous and bitter, and I took it out on both of you. You didn't deserve that. David was quiet for a long moment, and Deborah could feel him struggling with years of hurt and betrayal. Then he extended his hand. Thank you, David said. I know that wasn't easy to say. Marcus shook his hand, and something in his expression cracked. Grandfather told me, right before he died, that I was wasting my life being angry at you. He said I was too smart and too capable to spend all my energy on jealousy. And he was right. So, what now? David asked. Now I figure out who I am, separate from being your rival, Marcus said. Deborah's been helping me with that. She's surprisingly wise for someone who used to bring people drinks for a living. Hey, Deborah protested. There's a lot of wisdom in the service industry. You learn things about people when they think you're not paying attention. Clearly, Marcus said with a hint of a smile. Because you saw through all of us from day one. 2 years after the wedding, Deborah stood in the original Brooklyn location of North Star Cafe, now one of 5 locations across New York, and watched her staff handle the morning rush with practiced efficiency. She'd built something real, something sustainable, something that would exist long after she was gone. David appeared at her elbow, coffee in hand, looking slightly rumpled from having rushed over from an early meeting. How's the empire? Deborah teased. Thriving, David replied. Yours? Same. They stood together, watching the cafe bustle with life, people meeting friends, working on laptops, reading books, having first dates. All of them found a small moment of comfort and connection in the space Deborah had created. Do you ever think about how differently things could have turned out? David asked. If you'd said no that night in the coffee shop. Sometimes, Deborah admitted. But then I remember that saying yes was the first truly brave thing I'd done in years. And it led to all of this. She gestured at the cafe, at their life together, at the future they were still building. Best $2 million I ever spent, David said. I thought this wasn't about money, Deborah said. It's not, David replied. But it started with money, and I'm okay acknowledging that. We took something transactional and made it real. That's not something to be ashamed of, it's something to be proud of. Deborah's phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca Sterling, just finished editing the one-year follow-up episode. You and David are going to love it. Or hate it. Possibly both. Want to preview it before it airs. Rebecca wants us to preview the follow-up podcast, Deborah said to David. Are you ready to relive our first year of marriage for public consumption? As long as we get to relive it together, David said. I can handle anything. They left the cafe in the capable hands of Deborah's staff and headed back to the penthouse to listen to Rebecca's episode. As they walked through Manhattan, David's hand in hers, both of them just 2 people in love navigating the city, Deborah thought about how much had changed since that rainy October evening when a desperate billionaire had made her an offer she couldn't refuse. She'd gone from invisible to visible, from surviving to thriving, from protecting herself with walls to choosing vulnerability with someone who made the risk worthwhile. She'd built her cafe, found her voice, and created a life that was entirely her own, even as she'd chosen to share it with David. And most importantly, she'd learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say yes to something terrifying and see where it takes you. I love you, David said as they entered the penthouse, pulling her close. I love you too, Deborah replied. Even though you're the reason my life stopped being simple. Simple is overrated, David said. So is pretending, Deborah agreed. I'm glad we stopped. Me too, David said, and kissed her like he'd been wanting to all day. Outside, the city hummed with millions of stories, people falling in love, taking risks, building dreams. And in a penthouse overlooking it all, 2 people who'd started with a contract and found something real were writing their own story, one brave choice at a time. The compass pendant rested against Deborah's heart, a reminder that she could always find her way home. But the truth was, she'd already arrived. Home wasn't a place, it was David's arms around her, the cafe she'd built, the life they were creating together. Home was the courage to be fully seen and the trust that she was worth seeing. And that, Deborah thought as David led her toward the bedroom, was worth more than all the money in the world. Thanks for watching till the end. We know you loved this story, and there are many more thrilling ones waiting for you. Just click on the video on your screen to dive into the next chapter.